So far, this caretaker authority is composed of ministers from the Syrian Salvation Government that had been de facto the governing authority in Idlib for some years, under the leadership of Prime Minister Mohammed al-Bashir. At the same time, and this is important, Madam President, there are armed opposition groups that operate outside of the military operations command. For instance, parts of the Syrian National Army, most of which acts under the auspices of the opposition Syrian National Coalition. In addition, the northeast, as well as some neighborhoods of Aleppo city, remains under the control of the SDF, supported by the US. There have been significant hostilities in the last 2 weeks before a ceasefire was brokered between Turkey and the United States along the Euphrates River. A 5-day ceasefire has now expired, and I am seriously concerned about reports of military escalation, as well as reports of military buildups. Such an escalation could be catastrophic. Madam President, moreover, there is a new situation in the southwest. UNDOF continues to observe IDF personnel and equipment in multiple locations in the area of separation, and one location in the area of limitation in the vicinity of the Bravo line. There are media reports of Israeli advances several kilometers into Syrian territory. Israel has carried out more than 350 strikes on military facilities, equipments, and supplies across Syria since the former regime fell, and these continue, including an enormous attack in Tartus. Madam President, such attacks place a battered civilian population at further risk and undermine the prospects of an orderly political transition. We have also seen reports of the Israeli cabinet's plan to expand settlements in the Golan. Israel must cease all settlement activity in the occupied Syrian Golan, which are illegal. Attacks on Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity must stop. Madam President, let me now move to the challenges that Syria faces. The first major challenge is, of course, that the conflict has not ended. Yes, we are seeing a Syria that is stable at present in many parts. Many in Damascus tells me that the law and order improved significantly after 2 initial days of instability. But stability can be fragile in many parts of Syria. And in the northeast, there are still front lines and open hostilities in which civilians are being killed, injured, and displaced. Civilians must be protected wherever they are. There must be de-escalations towards a nationwide ceasefire, as well as efforts to address tensions between military factions. The second challenge is the sheer scale of needs. Syria's economy has been ravaged by this dreadful conflict, its infrastructure destroyed, 90% of Syrians living in poverty. Let me just stress that these are enormous challenges that will require all of our support in the manner that will have to go beyond the humanitarian in terms of economic development, reconstruction, and the process to address and ultimately end sanctions. And of course, Madam President, the third challenge is of course political. The Syrian people have sacrificed so much so that they can determine their own future and realize their legitimate aspirations. We must ensure that the political process remains on track. Otherwise, I fear new instability. Madam President, Before traveling to Damascus, I joined representatives of the Arab Contact Group on Syria, along with ministers and representatives of Bahrain, France, Germany, Qatar, Turkey, the UAE, the UK, US, and the European Union. This meeting expressed a common belief that the transitional political process must be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned and produce an inclusive, non-sectarian and representative government formed through a transparent process based on the principles of Security Council Resolution 2254. The Aqaba statement emphasized support for my mandate. In addition, Madam President, I think there is broad understanding that Resolution 2254 cannot, in the new circumstances, be applied mechanically. But the core principles have wide Syrian consensus. And while Resolution 2254 identified two parties, one of whom has been toppled and cannot feature in the process, it is still the case that the political transition is needed and that this will require an inclusive intra-Syrian process. Madam President, what can this look like? First, Syrians need an orderly transition that provides for preservation of state institutions that serve their interests and provide them with critical services. Here, let me take note of the efforts to ensure this already, in terms of safeguarding ministers of the former government to transfer power and calling on state employees to continue their work. This provides a strong first basis, but it is not in itself enough. Second, the transition must also be credible and inclusive, including the broader spectrum of Syrian society and Syrian parties, so that it inspires public confidence. And here let me emphasize that this is a clear desire expressed by Syrians themselves. Just as we saw significant military coordination between many groups in the recent operations, now, as we are moving forward and into a full political phase, this should be matched by inclusive political engagement. Third, there must be a new constitution in line with Resolution 2254. Fourth, there must be free and fair elections inclusive of all Syrians, as Resolution 2254 envisages, in accordance with international standards. And Madam President, here let me say, I fully appreciate the need to ensure quick service delivery and law and order. Stability is fundamental. Competence is key too. But none of this is incompatible with a credible and inclusive political transition. It is precisely such an approach that can enable stability and indeed prevent new conflict. Madam President, I have discussed all of these elements in depth in Damascus. I met with the commander of the new administration, Mr. Ahmed al-Shara, and Prime Minister of the caretaker authorities, Mr. Mohammed al-Bashir. I also met here in Damascus with representatives of the Syrian Negotiations Commission, including armed group representatives that remain in contact with the leader, Badr Jamous. I also met with Syrian civil society and women. It was heartening to see so many of them, for years speaking across front lines, now together in their capital here in Damascus. They continue to be at the forefront of the emergency response and relief to all Syrians. Their inclusive participation is a cornerstone to sustainable peace. Madam President, Concrete movement on an inclusive political transition will be key in ensuring Syria receives the economic support it needs. There is clear international willingness to engage. The needs are immense and could only be addressed with broad support, including a smooth end to sanctions, appropriate action on designations too, and full reconstruction. It is clear that the period ahead will be critical, and there are international signals that broader measures can gain traction with progress on a credible and inclusive political transition. This was an important theme in Aqaba, which stressed that Syria at last has a chance to break decades of isolation. This chance, Madam President, must be seized. Finally, let me note my meeting with Syrian women here in Damascus, as well as the engagement of my office with women across Syria and those in exile. Syrian women seek assurances that their status and rights will be respected and built upon in any transitional arrangements, with the needs of women and girls fully taken into account. Because the reality remains that Syrian women these last years have reported significant backlash. And not only this, Syrian women must be a part of the transition itself. Otherwise, it cannot be considered to be inclusive. Madam President, yesterday I saw with my own eyes the dungeons, torture, and execution chambers of Sednaya prison. A testament to the barbarity of the fallen regimes towards its own people. I met a man released from Sednaya just 10 days ago who told me how he was tortured. An elderly woman, also recently released, said she wanted first and foremost justice. Another woman was desperately seeking clarity on the fate of her son, who was detained and whose 4 children she raised single-handedly. Of course, Syrian, UN, and other organizations have been documenting this for years, thanks to the courage of survivors and witnesses. But seeing the reality firsthand was a stark reminder of the centrality of transitional justice, the need for clarification of the fate and whereabouts of missing and disappeared persons, and ensuring due process in criminal prosecutions as a necessary safeguard against acts of revenge. Without this, Syria and Syrians will not be able to heal. And, Madam President, here let me stress an urgent first step: the protection of evidence and material, as well as sites of mass graves. We must safeguard the right of the victims and their families and survivors to both truth and justice. And we need the immediate release of all those still detained and arbitrarily across the country. Let me say that on this and across all fronts, I have been in contact with many parts of the UN system, and there is a determination across the system to strengthen the UN presence here in Syria. Madam President, Syria is for all Syrians. Now is the time for Syrians to step forward and lead. Now is the time to reassure all Syrians that their stake in the future is understood and that it will be embodied in a credible and inclusive transitional arrangements. I have made clear in Damascus my invitation to a dialogue on the Resolution 2254 and all other issues relevant to Syrians, so that we can identify a Syrian-owned and led way forwards. Madam President, of course, it is only 11 days since the fall of the former regime. My door is open, and I hope in the coming days we can build that dialogue. I understand, we all do, the massive challenges facing the authorities and the need to help concretely? No. We understand the need for stability, but stability will not last long if not built on credible and inclusive foundations. The time is to build those foundations now. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Pedersen for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Thomas Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you to Special Envoy Pedersen for his unflagging work, which I've had the privilege to see firsthand here in Damascus. Madam President, the pace of developments in Syria, as you've heard from Geir, over the past 3 weeks has been dramatic. What has not changed is the scale of the humanitarian crisis. Syria was already one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world, with 17 million people, more than 70% of the population in need of support. More than 7 million people were displaced across the country, millions more Syrians living as refugees. Nearly 13 million people were facing acute food insecurity. The recent escalation has only added to these needs. More than 1 million people were displaced in less than 2 weeks. Hundreds of civilians killed and injured, at least 80 of them children. Health services, water supplies, already corroded by years of conflict and declining funding, were interrupted. And more than 12,000 schools were temporarily shut down, affecting millions of students. With borders, commercial routes closed, there have been shortages of bread, fuel, and other key items. Likewise, the flow of humanitarian support was severely disrupted, with most organizations temporarily suspending operations. Several warehouses have been looted. Multiple aid workers from NGOs and the Syrian Arab Red Crescent lost their lives. Thankfully, Madam President, the situation has begun to stabilize. As I've seen this week, markets, roads, health facilities are reopening. Children have gone back to school. Aid operations are gradually resuming across most of our hubs, including Aleppo, Homs, and here in Damascus. It is critical that we adapt the humanitarian response to the new, if still rapidly shifting, conditions. And that is why I'm here in Syria. First, to ensure that we are coordinated. Over the past 2 days, I've been looking closely at our systems for working together. We want to further support humanitarian leadership by drawing flexibly from the resources from across our hubs, including in Amman and Gaziantep, leveraging the strength of the system in place for Syria. We're also finding more ways to work closely with cross-border actors in northeast Syria to align efforts, but also to ensure the safety of humanitarian actors. These efforts will ensure that we have a cast iron grip of the coordination effort, as clear a picture as possible of the emerging needs across the country, and that we can direct resources in a swift and agile way using all available channels. Tomorrow, I'll travel to Aleppo, where we are already embarking on this approach. OCHA's office there is bringing together UN agency teams and NGOs previously working in areas formerly controlled by the Assad government, with those working on the cross-border response. I then plan to visit Idlib, where humanitarian needs are among the most severe. As the situation evolves and following my visit, we will also swiftly issue an overview of critical funding needs for the next 3 months. Madam President, the second reason for my visit is to ensure that the humanitarian community has the best possible conditions in which to work. While here in Damascus, I've met with representatives of the new caretaker government, including the commander of the new administration, Mr. Ahmed al-Sharaa, and the Prime Minister, Mr. Mohammed al-Bashir. I have been encouraged by these discussions, and I'm pleased to report that they have committed to what will be an ambitious scaling up of vital humanitarian support. We have received assurances that they will facilitate the movement of aid personnel and supplies from neighboring countries, including from Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, for as long as humanitarian operations are required. Again, this includes routes into areas controlled by other parties in the northeast. The intensification of conflict between actors in northeast Syria and its potential humanitarian fallout is a case for concern and warrants urgent attention and efforts for de-escalation. We also received assurances that access to people in need will be facilitated wherever they are in Syria, including across lines of conflict and into the northeast. We received commitments on the issuance of visas, work permits for aid workers, and NGO registration documents. The resident and humanitarian coordinator and authorities are developing a set of guidelines on this. And we received commitments on protecting and respecting the principled nature of humanitarian operations. This includes the conduct of independent needs assessments and selection of beneficiaries, the ability to choose our own partners, including those who have been working in government-held areas and those currently working in the northeast, and assurances that there will not be restrictions on employing women who are absolutely essential to our mission. Absolutely essential. These commitments alone will not relieve people's suffering, but they are an essential basis for us to scale up operations. Madam President, the third reason for my visit is to ensure that I can make concrete requests of the international community, including the Security Council. So from you, we need three things. First, strong, unequivocal messaging that international humanitarian law must be respected, both in any ongoing hostilities and in meeting people's basic needs. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected. Those on the move must be allowed to do so safely. The missing must be accounted for. And where hostilities have ended, landmines and explosive remnants of war must be removed. And, as the authorities agreed, unhindered humanitarian access to those in need, wherever they are, must be facilitated. A second request, we need more money. I recognize the generosity of donors for the Syria crisis over the years. Since 2016, more than $38 billion has gone to the UN coordinated appeals for Syria and for the regional refugee response. But this year's humanitarian appeal, the largest country appeal in the world right now, is also one of the most poorly supported. With just 2 weeks left in 2024, it is less than a third funded, the largest ever funding gap for the Syria response. Now is the time to invest in the Syrian people, to support flexible funds so that we can respond to changing needs. The UN Central Emergency Response Fund has already allocated $32 million to Syria this year. Now is also the time for member states to work on development support to rebuilding Syria, reducing dependence on humanitarian support and maintaining essential services. A third request, we need all states to facilitate the humanitarian effort, including by ensuring that sanctions and counterterrorism measures do not impede humanitarian operations. I will travel next to Ankara to discuss the crisis with the government of Turkey. Turkey's facilitation of cross-border humanitarian operations in Syria for many years has been a lifeline. I will also be discussing the crisis with authorities in Lebanon and Jordan, who have been such generous hosts of Syrian refugees. Madam President, when war erupted in Syria 13 years ago, I was in Lebanon, just the short drive away that I took yesterday. And neither I nor anyone could have imagined then the full extent of the suffering the people of Syria would endure for more than a decade. The world let them down. We let them down. But there is now as the Secretary General has said, an historic opportunity to put that right and support the Syrian people, especially women and girls, in their hope for a more peaceful future. I pay tribute to the Syrian people for their patience, but they have waited too long. Giving them this support now will take patience, creativity, and determination. The progress we make will be inconsistent, and the risks of failure great. But this should be a galvanizing project for the UN and for the humanitarian movement. And so, at a moment of hope and peril, we must rise to the challenge and back the people of Syria. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Fletcher for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Wad Al-Khatib.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, members of the United Nations Security Council. On the 8th of December, millions of Syrians scattered across the world in refugee camps, in exile, or inside our homeland, held their breath as we watched the news. It was a moment we sacrificed everything for. A moment of joy, but also one of deep grief. A chapter in Syria's history that will forever remain bittersweet. For the first time, Syrian activists began announcing their real names, reclaiming the identity they hid for years out of fear. Groups from the early days of the revolution began to reactivate, inspired to think about their role in the Syria future. It was a moment of victory, born from years of unimaginable suffering. It's ironic how 8 years ago, this very week, I was forcibly displaced out of my city, Aleppo. I carried my 1-year-old daughter in one arm, my unborn baby in my womb, and my hard drives hidden beneath my clothes, containing the truth of our struggle. I didn't know if we would survive, but I held on one truth. The evidence of our suffering would remain even if I didn't make it. Since that day, many countries told us to accept the new reality, that they have normalized with Assad, a man whose regime killed our beloved ones, destroyed our homes, and turned our dreams to dust. I refused to believe it, but I began preparing myself for a life where I would never see a free Syria. Every day, I whispered to myself, if not for me, then for my daughters to see. When I made my film for Sama, I traveled the world sharing our story. Over and over, leaders, politicians, and diplomats said to me, we wish we have done more. We should have done more. Today, I stand here to tell you, you can do more. Yes, history repeats itself, but it rarely gives us the chance to correct our mistakes. This is your chance today. The fall of Assad regime did not happen in 11 days or through one recent battle. It happened because of the countless sacrifices, struggles, and the losses of the Syrian people. It happens because 13 million Syrians were forced from their homes, hundreds of thousands drowned at sea. Countless others died in bombed schools and hospitals, and hundreds of thousands were detained, tortured, and forcibly disappeared. It happened when the Syrian people lost everything except their voices, their courage, and their hope. It was not announced with the military victories or grand declaration. It was civilians. 2 young men rode on a motorbike into an empty tank in Umayya Square. 4 women blasted Abdel Basit Sarut song, Thuri Thuri Dara, Uprise, Uprise Dara, in their car, waving to a future they had not yet seen. These were ordinary people, civilians, not soldiers, not even activists, declaring the fall of a tyrant. But this moment is not the end of our struggle. It's only the beginning of a new chapter. We ask this Council to act in line within Resolution 2254 and help us to achieve a real political transition, one that includes all Syrians from all regions and also the diaspora. The transition must lead to a new constitution and free, fair election. It must adhere to international standards of transparency, justice, and accountability. But this transition cannot happen without justice. The Assad regime has turned Syria into a theater of unimaginable crimes. Families have been searching for their beloved ones for over a decade. In recent days, the release of detainees from Sednaya was a tragic reminder of this brutality. Heartbreaking videos of chaos outside prisons filled our screens, families desperately searching for loved ones, while documents burned and records were destroyed forever. The regime cruelty was not just about detention. It was about erasing lives, silencing truth, and leaving families in endless uncertainty. Wafa Mustafa, my dear friend, whose father was detained in 2013 and whose fate is still unknown until today, asks a question that broke us all from our hearts. Where was the UN? Where was the ICRC in those critical days? Why am I supposed to identify my father's body on Instagram? Why are we seeing documents and IDs scattered on the ground, these precious pieces of evidence of our beloved ones? They could hold the only truth about what happened to them, and yet we are being denied even that. Madam President, the international community must act. Families for loved ones deserve access to the truth, access to every prison, to every mass grave, to every part of justice. The bombing must be stopped. Israel's recent strikes are blatant breach of international law. They must be held accountable for that. The protection of civilians is vital. In northeast Syria, violence and instability continues to devastate lives. A unified, coordinated approach is urgently needed to build a safe, stable future for all Syrians. And do not forget also the millions of Syrian refugees all over the world. Their future remains frozen, their dignity denied. These are not numbers. They are families, mothers, fathers, and children who deserve stability and the chance to rebuild their lives. Madam President, for too long, Syria has been left to bleed while the world debated and hesitated. For too long, we have been waiting for action. The time for excuses is over, and this is the time for action. We, the Syrian people, have shown the world our resilience, our courage, and unwavering belief in freedom. I'm asking you to stand with us, to support our demand for justice and accountability, and to help us build a political transition that reflects the dream and sacrifice of all Syrians. And to my fellow Syrians, whether in camps, in exile, or still holding on inside our homeland, we carry today a great responsibility. The sacrifices of the past 14 years have brought us to this moment. We must rise together, united, to rebuild our country with justice, dignity, and freedom for all. This is our chance, and we cannot let it split away. To all oppressed people around the world, to political prisoners, to the displaced, and to the refugees, hope lives in every voice that refuses to be silent, in every heart that refuses to give up. Hold on, because the freedom is coming, and it belongs to us all. As I end, I want to pay tribute to all those who sacrificed their lives so we could see this day. We carry their memory, their courage, and their dreams with us. Today, as the UN Security Council holds its first briefing after Syria freedom, Syria without Assad, we take our first steps into a new future, and this is only the beginning. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. Al-Khatib for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Badr Jamous.
بداية أترحم على أرواح
At the
شهداء
outset, I
سوريا
pay tribute
الذين
to the
قضوا
souls
في
of the
الثورة
martyrs
السورية
of
العظيمة.
Syria who died
السيدة
for the
رئيسة
sake of
مجلس
Syria.
الأمن،
Madam President,
السيدات والسادة أعضاء
ladies
المجلس،
and gentlemen, members of the
أقف
Council,
أمامكم اليوم
I
باسم
stand
الشعب
before
السوري
you
العظيم
today on
لأعبر
behalf
عن
of the great
فخرنا
Syrian people
واعتزازنا
to
بهذا
express
اليوم
our pride
التاريخي
of this
الذي
historic day
أشرقت فيه شمس الحرية على
when
سوريا.
the sun of freedom
يوم الثامن من كانون
rose over
الأول
Syria.
ديسمبر
On the 8th of
يمثل
December,
انتصار إرادة
or the
الشعب
8th of
السوري
December, represents the
الذي
triumph
أجبر
of the will of
أو
the
أجبر
Syrian
النظام
people,
المستبد
which
على الفرار
compelled
من
the
دمشق.
authoritarian regime
إنه
to
يوم
flee
سيظل
Damascus.
خالدا في
This
ذاكرة
day will
السوريين.
remain immortalized in the memory of
لقد
the
حذرنا
Syrians.
مرارا
We
وتكرارا
had
من أن
warned
صبر
yet
الشعب
time and
السوري
again that the
الذي
patience
التزم
of the
طويلا
Syrian
بالسعي
people,
نحو
which
حل
was
سياسي تفاوضي
committed to a
وسلمي لن
negotiated
يدوم
peaceful
إلى الأبد.
settlement, will
ومع
not
الأسف
last forever.
فقد السوريون
Unfortunately,
الثقة
the
بقدرة
Syrians
المجتمع
lost
الدولي
their trust in the
والأمم
ability of
المتحدة
the
على
international
حماية
community and the
المبادئ
United Nations to protect
الإنسانية
the humanitarian
الشعوب
principles and to do
الساعية
justice
للعدالة.
to peoples
وعلى
seeking
مدار
justice.
13 عاما
For
بذلت
13
المعارضة
years, the
السورية
Syrian
ممثلة
opposition,
بهيئة
represented
التفاوض
by the
كل
negotiations
الجهود
commissions,
الممكنة
spared no effort
وأظهرت أقصى
and
درجات المرونة
showed
في
maximum
تحقيق
flexibility
انتقال
to
سياسي
ensure
سلمي.
a peaceful
لكن
political
النظام المستبد
transition. But
ظل
the
العقبة
authoritarian
الكبرى
regime remained
متجاهلا
the main
جميع
obstacle,
المبادرات
ignored
التي
all
قادها
the initiatives
4 مبعوثين
launched by
دوليين
4 international
بينما دفع
envoys, while
السوريون
the
ثمنا
Syrians
باهظا من دمائهم
paid with their
وأرواحهم.
blood and lives a very high
لقد
price.
شرد السوريون في جميع أنحاء
Syrians were
العالم كلاجئين
displaced all over the
يبحثون عن
world.
الأمان
They
والكرامة
were turned into
فيما
refugees
تحملت
looking for
المعارضة
security
مسؤولية
and dignity.
تحقيق تطلعات الشعب السوري
The opposition
نحو
took
دولة
upon
القانون
itself to meet the
والحرية
aspirations of the Syrian
والعدالة
people
والمواطنة.
towards
لم تكن
the
معركتنا
state
فقط
of
مع
law,
النظام
freedom, justice,
بل
and
مع
citizenship.
الاستقطابات
Our battle
الإقليمية
was not
والدولية
only with the regime, but
التي
with
جعلت
regional and
مهمتنا أكثر
international
صعوبة.
polarizations,
ومع
which
ذلك
made our
لم
mission
نتوقف
even
عن
more
النضال
difficult. Despite
رغم
all
الأسئلة
that, we
الصعبة
never
التي
stopped struggling,
واجهتنا
despite
أين
the
الحل
difficult
السياسي
questions that
وأين
were asked.
تنفيذ
Where is the
القرار
political solution and where is
2254
the implementation of Resolution
اليوم
2254?
وبعد سقوط النظام
Today,
أصبح
after
جليا
the fall of the
للعالم
regime,
حجم
the world
الجرائم والانتهاكات
bears witness
التي
to
ارتكبها هذا
the
النظام
scope
بحق
of the
شعبنا.
crimes and
لقد
violations
كشفت
perpetrated by
السجون
the regime against our
والمعتقلات عن
people.
فظائع
Prisons and detention
وحشية
centers have
ستظل
revealed
وصمة
brutal
عار في
horrors
تاريخ
that will
البشرية.
remain a stain on the human
ونؤكد من هذا
conscience.
المنبر
From this
أننا
rostrum,
سنستمر في
we
ملاحقة
reaffirm
هذا
that
النظام
we will prosecute
ورئيسه
this
الفار
regime and
قضائيا
its fugitive
ولن ندخر
president, and
جهدا
we will spare no
لتحقيق
effort to
العدالة
secure
وإنصاف
justice
الضحايا.
and to do justice
إن
to the
العدالة
victims.
الانتقالية
Transitional
والمساءلة
justice
ليست
and
خيار
accountability
بل
are
ضرورة
not a choice, they are
لضمان
an
عدم
imperative
تكرار هذه
to make
الجرائم.
sure that these
السيدة
crimes
رئيس
are
مجلس
not
الأمن
repeated.
السيدات والسادة أعضاء
Madam
المجلس،
President, ladies and
نثمن
gentlemen,
الجهود
we
التي
value the
تبذلها
efforts
الإدارة
made
الحالية
by the current
ورئيسها أحمد
administration
الشرع
and its
ورئيس
president
الحكومة
Ahmed
المؤقتة
al-Shara
السيد
and
البشير في دمشق
the
لاستعادة
caretaker
الأمن
prime
وتقديم
minister to
الخدمات
restore
للمواطنين.
security and provide
ونؤكد
services to
عملنا
citizens.
المشترك
We
في بناء
reaffirm
سوريا
that we are ready
الجديدة،
to work together to
دولة
build a new Syria,
يتساوى
a
فيها
state
الجميع
where
في
all
الحقوق
citizens are
والواجبات،
equal in rights and
خالية من
obligations, a
التدخلات
state
الخارجية،
free from
وتحافظ
foreign
على علاقات
interventions,
متوازنة مع
which
جيرانها
builds balanced
وأصدقائها.
relations with its neighbors and
هذا
friends.
النصر لم يكن
This
ليتحقق
victory
لولا
wouldn't have
تضحيات
been achieved
السوريين
if it
جميعا،
weren't for the sacrifices of all
الشهداء
the
الذين
Syrians,
ضحوا
the
بحياتهم
martyrs
من
who
أجل الحرية،
sacrificed their life for freedom,
المعتقلون
the
الذين
detainees
صبروا في
who
زنازين الظلم،
languished in dark cells of
اللاجئين
injustice, the
الذين عانوا
refugees
لسنوات
who
طويلة في
suffered for long
المخيمات،
years in camps,
الثوار
the
الذين
rebels
واجهوا
who
الموت
faced death
لتحرير
to
الوطن،
free their nation.
الصحفيين
The
الذين
journalists
أوصلوا صوت
who
الحق،
conveyed the voice of
السياسيون
the
الذين
truth,
ناضلوا في المحافل
politicians
الدولية،
who fought in
المجتمع
international
المدني الذي أبدع
instances,
حلولا عملية
the civil
رغم
society
التحديات،
which created practical
القانونيون الذين
solutions
لاحقوا
despite
المجرمين،
challenges, and legal professionals who
النساء السوريات
prosecuted
اللواتي
crimes.
كن
The
عنوانا
Syrian women
للصمود
who were
والإصرار،
symbols of
الشباب السوري
resilience and
الذي استثمر
determination,
في
and the
تعليمه
Syrian youth
لبناء
which invested in
مستقبل
its
سوريا
education to
المشرق.
build a bright future
كما
for
أود
Syria.
أن نعرب عن خالص
We would
شكرنا
also
للدول
like to
التي
convey our
وقفت إلى جانبنا
heartfelt thanks to
حتى
the
اللحظة
countries
الأخيرة
which stood by
وساندتنا
us until the
وأمنت
last
بأن
moment,
الشعب
which
السوري
supported us
قادر
and
على
believed that
التغيير
the Syrian
ولن
people is
يرضخ
capable of
حتى
change
ينال
and will not
حريته.
succumb until
لقد
they
كانت تلك
achieve
الدول
their
شريكا
freedom.
أساسيا
These
في
states
دعم
were an
حقنا
essential
في
partner
الحرية
in supporting
والكرامة
our right to
ولن ننسى
freedom and
مواقفها
dignity,
الشجاعة
and we will
معنا.
never forget their brave stance.
السيدة السيدة رئيس مجلس
Madam
السيدات
President,
والسادة.
ladies and gentlemen,
لقد ترك النظام المستبد
the
سوريا في حالة من
authoritarian regime left Syria in a
حيث
state
يعيش
of
80%
economic
من
devastation.
السكان
80%
تحت
of
خط
the people
الفقر.
live below the
لقد آن
poverty line.
الأوان
It is
لرفع
time to
العقوبات
lift the economic
الاقتصادية
sanctions
المفروضة على الدولة
imposed on the
السورية
Syrian state
وزيادة الدعم
and to
الإنساني
increase humanitarian
والإغاثي
and relief
لتمكيننا
support
من
to
إعادة
allow us
بناء
to
وطننا.
rebuild our country.
رغم التغيرات التي شهدتها
Despite the
سوريا
changes
وما
in Syria,
زلنا رغم التغيرات التي
and
شهدتها سوريا ما زلنا نؤمن
so
أن
despite these
روح
changes in
القرار
Syria, we still believe
2254
that
يشكل
that
خارطة
resolution
الطريق لتحقيق
2254 is
تطلعات
the
شعبنا.
roadmap to meet the
صحيح أن
aspirations of
الظروف
our people.
قد تغيرت
It is true that the
وأن النظام
circumstances
الذي
have
كان
changed
طرفا
and that
في
the
هذا
regime,
القرار
which was
قد انهار
party
إلا
to
أن
this resolution, has
القرار
collapsed.
وجوهره
But the spirit
المتمثل
and
في
the essence
تحقيق
of the
حكم
resolution, which
الشعب
aims
لنفسه
at
من خلال
allowing the people to
انتخابات
govern
نزيهة
itself
تحت إشراف
through
الأمم
fair
المتحدة لا
elections
يزال هو
under the
المبدأ
supervision of the
الذي
UN.
نستند
This
إليه.
resolution is still the
ليبدأ
principle
حوارا
based on
في
which we
دمشق
work.
لكل القوى
So
الوطنية
we need to
بإشراف
initiate a
الأمم
dialogue
المتحدة
in Damascus
وعليه
under the
ندعو
auspices of the
إلى العمل
UN.
على
Therefore, we
تشكيل
call for
حكومة وطنية
establishing
انتقالية
an inclusive
شاملة
transitional
تمثل
national
جميع أطياف
government that
الشعب
represents all
السوري
the segments
من
of the
الثوار
Syrian people, which
والسياسيين
includes the
والمجتمع
rebels,
المدني
politicians, and
وكافة
civil society,
مكونات الشعب
all the
السوري
components of
مع
the Syrian
ضمان
people,
تمثيل
and
المرأة
guarantees the
والشباب.
representation of women
اثنين
and youth.
عقد مؤتمر وطني
Second, there is a
شامل
need to
تتولى
organize an
الحكومة
inclusive
الانتقالية
national
تنظيمه
conference organized by
لاختيار
the transitional
جمعية
government
تأسيسية
to
من
choose a
الحكماء
constituent
والخبراء
assembly that brings
والعلماء
together wise men,
والسياسيين
experts,
ورجال
scientists,
الدولة
politicians,
ووجوه
statesmen,
المجتمع
and
ومن
community leaders,
المخضرمين
as well
ومن
as
الشباب
veterans
تكلف
and the youth.
بإعداد
And
دستور
this
جديد
assembly will be
يعبر عن
entrusted with
تطلعات
elaborating a new
السوريين
constitution
والسوريات.
that reflects the aspirations of Syrian men
تنظيم
and women.
استفتاء على الدستور
3.
الجديد
Organize a
والمضي
referendum on the new
قدما
constitution
نحو
and
انتخابات حرة
organize
نزيهة
fair,
في
free
بيئة آمنة
elections in an
ومحايدة
impartial,
تحت
safe
إشراف الأمم
environment under the
المتحدة.
supervision of the
كما
United
نشدد
Nations.
على أهمية
We also emphasize
اتخاذ
the need to
الإجراءات
take the
التالية.
following measures.
إنشاء صندوق لدعم
Creating a fund
المعتقلين
to support
الذين
the
تم الإفراج
detainees that
عنهم
were released,
لتأمين
to secure their
احتياجاتهم
needs
وإعادة
and to
دمجهم في
reintegrate them
المجتمع بعد
in
سنوات من
society
المعاناة.
after years of
إنشاء
suffering.
صندوق لدعم
To
أسر شهداء
establish a fund to
الثورة
support
الذين
the
ارتقوا تحت
families
التعذيب
of
في
the
معتقلات
martyrs of
النظام
the
الوحشية
revolution who
أو في
died
ساحات
under
الحرب
torture
أو
in the
شنها
barbaric detention
التي شنها على المدنيين
centers,
الأبرياء
or during the
لتكريم
war waged by
تضحياتهم
the regime
والتعويض
against
عن
innocent
ذويهم
civilians to
وهو
honor
أقل
their
ما يمكن
sacrifices
فعله
and to
أمام
compensate their
الحقائق
families. And this is the least we
المفجعة
can do in
التي
view of the
تشاهدونها
horrifying
على
facts
الشاشات.
that you are seeing on screens.
على الشاشات اليوم في
Whether
صيدنايا
in
أو في
Saidnaya or
غيرها
elsewhere,
أو في المقابر الجماعية التي نكتشف
or the
وجودها
mass
كل يوم.
graves that are being discovered every day.
3 إعادة
4
المشقين عن النظام
to
والمفصولين من
secure the
وظائفهم
return
ظلما
of the regime
إلى
defectors
مواقعهم
and
فورا
those who were unfairly
وصرف كافة
dismissed from their
مستحقاتهم
services
المالية
and to
فهؤلاء
disperse their
دفعوا كل
financial
ما
dues.
لديهم
They have paid
للوقوف
everything
بجانب
they had
شعبهم
to
وأهلهم.
stand by their people
إنشاء
and their
صندوق
country.
لدعم
To
اللاجئين
create a fund to support the
والمهجرين في
refugees and
العودة
the
إلى سوريا
displaced
لتأمين
who
احتياجاتهم
desire to return to
وضمان
Syria to
عودتهم
guarantee
بشكل
their needs
كريم
and to
وآمن.
secure their safe and
السيد رئيس
dignified
مجلس
return.
الأمن
Madam
السيدات والسادة
President, ladies and
إننا
gentlemen,
عازمون على بناء
we are
سوريا
determined to
الجديدة
build the new
دولة
Syria,
القانون
a state of law,
والعدالة
of justice,
جمهورية
and of
تنتمي إلى هذا
democracy,
العصر
a republic
تحمي
that
جميع
belongs to these
مواطنيها دون
times, that
تمييز
protects all its
وتبقى
citizens
موحدة
without
أرضا
discrimination,
وشعبا.
and which remains
سوريا
united
المستقبل
in its land and its
ستكون
people.
نموذجا
The Syria
لدولة
of the
حديثة
future will be a
تدار
model of a
بعقول
modern
أبنائها
state governed by its
وإرادتها
people
الحرة.
and their
شكرا
free will.
لكم.
Thank you.
I thank Mr. Jamous for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci Madame la Présidente.
Thank you,
Je
Madam
voudrais
President.
aussi commencer par remercier le sous-secrétaire général et directeur
Begin by
d'OCHA,
thanking
Tom
the other
Fletcher,
Secretary General and
et
Director of
l'envoyé
OCHA, Tom
spécial
Fletcher,
pour la
and
Syrie, Geir
the
Pedersen,
Special
non
Envoy for
seulement
Syria, Geir
de leurs
Pedersen,
exposés, mais aussi
for
du
their
travail
briefings,
précieux
but also
de ces
for
derniers
their
jours, y
precious
inclus
work over
en
the last few
Syrie.
days, including in
Et
Syria.
je remercie également M. Bader
I also
Jamous,
thank Mr. Bader
président du
Jamous,
comité de négociation
Chairman
syrien,
of the Syrian
de sa
Negotiating
déclaration.
Committee, for
Et
his
je
statement.
remercie Madame Waad
And I
Al-Khateb,
thank
cofondatrice de la
Waad
Fondation
Al-Khatib,
Action
co-founder
pour
of the
Sama,
Action
pour avoir
for
partagé
Sama
avec nous
Foundation,
son
for
histoire.
sharing
En
her story with
l'espace
us.
de quelques semaines
In the
seulement,
space of
un
just a
nouveau
few
chapitre
weeks, a
s'est
new
ouvert en
chapter has
Syrie.
opened in Syria.
Les Syriennes et les Syriens font face à une tâche
The
colossale
Syrians
et
are facing
formidable.
a colossal
Il faut
and
assurer que
formidable
justice
task.
soit rendue
They
pour les
must
toutes
And
les
I'd like
familles
to
syriennes
join in the
pour toutes les
condolences for
souffrances
all
endurées
Syrian
de
families,
l'envoyé
for all of
spécial.
the sufferings
Il
that
est
they
grand
have
temps
endured.
maintenant de pouvoir
It's
rédiger
high
une
time
nouvelle
now to
page
be able
d'histoire.
to write a
La
new
Suisse
page of
continuera
history.
de soutenir
Switzerland
la
will continue
recherche de
to
liberté et de
support
justice,
their quest
de
for
dialogue et de
freedom and justice,
réconciliation
dialogue
des
and
Syriennes et
reconciliation,
Syriens, la mise en valeur d'une
the
identité
enhancement of their
plurielle
plural
et la
identity, and the
reconstruction d'une
rebuilding
nation
of
sur
their
les fondements
nation
de
on
l'état
the
de droit.
foundations of the rule of law.
Durant les 2 années de notre mandat au Conseil de sécurité,
During
la Suisse
its
a
two-year
répété
term
que
on the
seule
Security
une
Council,
solution
Switzerland has
politique inclusive,
reiterated that only
menée
an
par et pour
inclusive
les Syriennes
political
et Syriens,
solution led by
facilitée
and
par
for the
l'ONU et
Syrians,
son envoyé
facilitated
spécial
by the
et
UN and
fondée
its
sur
special
le droit
envoy, and
international
based on
pourra mettre
international
fin au
law, can
conflit.
put an end to the conflict.
Les autorités émergentes en Syrie
The
ont
emerging
désormais
authorities
une
in Syria
opportunité
now have an
historique
historic
de se démarquer
opportunity
clairement
to
de leurs
clearly
prédécesseurs
distinguish
en
themselves from their
soutenant une
predecessors
transition
by
politique
supporting
inclusive
an
et durable,
inclusive and
conforme aux
sustainable
principaux
political
éléments
transition
de la
in line
résolution
with the main elements of
2254.
Resolution 2254.
Parmi ces éléments figurent
These
un
elements
cessez-le-feu au
include
niveau national,
a national
qui doit être
ceasefire,
aussi observé par
which
toutes les
must also
parties
be
au
observed
conflit,
by all
à
parties to
commencer
the
par les
conflict,
États voisins de la
starting
Syrie.
with Syria's
Le
neighbours.
respect de la Charte des Nations Unies,
Respect for the United
du droit
Nations
international
Charter,
humanitaire et des droits
international
humains, y
humanitarian
compris
law
la
and human
protection des
rights, including the
minorités,
protection of
ainsi que de la
minorities,
souveraineté,
as
l'unité,
well as Syria's
l'indépendance
sovereignty,
et
unity,
l'intégrité
independence,
territoriale
and
de
territorial
la Syrie.
integrity.
Une gouvernance inclusive,
Inclusive
avec
governance,
participation
with the
active,
active
surtout aussi des
participation,
femmes
above
et de la
all,
société
of women
civile,
and civil
dont la
society,
Suisse n'a eu de cesse de
whose
promouvoir le
essential
rôle
role
essentiel.
Switzerland has constantly
Un rejet de
promoted.
toute forme de
Rejection of
terrorisme,
all forms
la
of
prise en
terrorism,
compte des aspirations
consideration
légitimes
of
du
the
peuple
legitimate
syrien dans
aspirations
toute
of
sa
the Syrian
diversité
people in
et
all
la
their
tenue
diversity,
d'élections libres,
and the holding of
inclusives,
free,
transparentes
inclusive,
et
and
régulières.
transparent and fair elections.
Par ailleurs, la Suisse est fortement préoccupée par les
Switzerland
derniers
is also
développements dans le
deeply
Golan
concerned by the
syrien
latest
occupé.
developments in the
Elle
occupied
appelle à
Syrian
ce que
Golan.
toute violation
It
de
calls for
l'accord
any
de
violation of the
1974 sur le
1974
dégagement des
agreement on the
forces
disengagement of
cesse
forces to
immédiatement
cease
et
immediately,
réitère son soutien
and
à
reiterates its
l'AFNUOD.
support for UNDOF.
La Suisse rappelle que le plateau du Golan
Switzerland
constitue
recalls
un
that the Golan
territoire
Heights
occupé.
constitute
Elle
occupied
condamne les
territory.
annonces du gouvernement
It condemns
israélien
the Israeli
de vouloir
government's
y doubler les
announcements that it
colonies
intends
qui
to
sont
double the number
illégales
of
en vertu
settlements
du
there,
droit
which are
international
illegal under
humanitaire.
international humanitarian law.
Madame la Présidente, la Suisse
Madam
continuera
President,
à mettre
Switzerland will
Genève
continue
à
to
disposition
make
pour tout
Geneva
pourparler
available
ou
for
initiative
all
de paix
peace talks
sous
and
l'égide de l'ONU et de son
initiatives
envoyé
under the aegis
spécial.
of the UN and its special
Mais
envoy.
Genève est aussi le siège de
But
deux
Geneva is
institutions clés
also
pour la
home to two
transition.
key institutions
La
for the
libération
transition.
récente de nombreux
The
détenus
recent
en
release of
Syrie
many
a
detainees
confirmé
in Syria
l'ampleur
has
des
confirmed
atrocités
the scale
commises
of
dans
the
les
atrocities
infâmes
committed
prisons
in the
du
Syrian
gouvernement
government's
syrien.
infamous
Mais
prisons.
elle a aussi apporté une lueur
But it has
d'espoir aux
also brought
familles
a glimmer
encore
of
en
hope
attente
to
des
families
nouvelles
still
de leurs
waiting for
proches.
news of their loved
Le
ones.
droit de savoir de ses proches
The right
est une
to know of
règle
these
solidement
relatives
ancrée
is a
dans les
rule
conventions de
firmly
Genève.
anchored in the Geneva
L'institution
Conventions.
indépendante pour les
The
personnes
independent
disparues, dont le
institution
mandat est
for
strictement
missing
humanitaire,
persons, whose
est
mandate
bien
is strictly
placée pour faire la
humanitarian,
lumière
is well
sur
placed
le
to
sort
shed
des
light on
dizaines
the
de milliers
fate
de
of tens
personnes
of thousands of
disparues
missing
dans tout le
persons
pays,
throughout the
en
country,
coopération avec les
in
associations des
cooperation with
familles de victimes
associations of
et
victims'
d'autres acteurs
families
et
and other
actrices
humanitarian
humanitaires.
actors.
Enfin, la Suisse rappelle qu'il n'y aura pas de paix
Finally,
durable sans
Switzerland
justice
reiterates
selon
that
les
can be
principes
no
de l'état
lasting
de droit.
peace without
Les
justice
preuves,
according to the
telles
principles of
qu'établies
the rule of
notamment par
law.
les archives et les
Evidence
récits
as
des victimes et
established in
témoins,
particular by
pourront
archives
soutenir
and
les
the
instances
accounts of
judiciaires
victims and
en matière
witnesses
de
which
reddition
can
des
support
comptes
the
doivent
judicial
être
authorities
préservées.
in rendering
La Suisse
accounts
souligne
must
le
be
rôle
preserved.
central du
Switzerland
mécanisme
stresses the central
international
role of the
impartial et
international,
indépendant à cet
impartial
égard.
and independent mechanism in
Madame
this
la
respect.
Présidente, au
Madam
cours des
President,
2 dernières années, la
over the
Suisse a
past
rempli
2
le rôle de
years,
porte-plume
Switzerland
sur le
has
dossier
played the role
humanitaire
of
en Syrie.
spokesperson on
Pendant son
humanitarian issues
mandat, et
in
notamment
Syria.
après les terribles
During its
tremblements de
mandate,
terre de
and in
février
particular after the
2023,
terrible
elle
earthquakes
s'est
of February
engagée pour que l'aide
2023,
humanitaire
it has been
parvienne
committed
de
to
manière
ensuring that
sûre, rapide et
humanitarian
sans
aid
entrave
reaches all
à
those
toutes les
in need
personnes dans le
safely,
besoin,
quickly,
par toutes les
and
modalités d'acheminement
without
possibles
hindrance,
et sur
using
l'intégralité
every
du
possible
territoire
means of
syrien.
delivery and covering the
Nous
whole
avons
of Syria.
souligné l'importance d'exemptions
We
humanitaires de
underline the
sanctions
importance of
pour faciliter
humanitarian
les
exemptions
activités
from
humanitaires,
sanctions to
notamment
facilitate
dans les domaines de
humanitarian
la santé,
activities,
de
particularly in
l'éducation
the
et de la
areas of
sécurité
health,
alimentaire.
education, and food
Nous
security.
continuerons d'encourager
We
les
will
réflexions
continue
à ce
to encourage
sujet
reflection
au
on this
regard des
subject
changements à la tête
in the
du
light
pays.
of the changes at the head of
Les
the
crises
country.
qui s'entrelacent depuis 13 années
The
ont
crises that
emporté
have
plus
been
d'un
intertwined
demi-million
over the
de
last
vies,
13 years
détruit
have
les
claimed more than
infrastructures
500,000
critiques,
lives,
précipité
destroyed
plus de
critical
90%
infrastructure,
la
free,
population
safe,
digne,
and dignified,
conformément au droit
in
international
accordance
pour
with
la
international
protection des
law for the
réfugiés
protection of
et des droits humains en
refugees and
général.
human rights in
La
general.
Suisse réitère sa solidarité
Switzerland
avec le peuple
reiterates its
syrien.
solidarity with
Dans
the
cet
Syrian
esprit,
people.
nous venons d'allouer 2 millions
With
de
this in
francs
mind, we have
supplémentaires
just
en faveur
allocated
de
a
l'aide
further
d'urgence en
2
Syrie.
million Swiss francs for
Nous
emergency
saluons le
aid in
déplacement du
Syria.
sous-secrétaire général et
We
directeur de
welcome
OCHA,
the visit to
Tom
Syria
Fletcher,
by
en
the
Syrie.
Undersecretary General and Director
Celui-ci
of
a
OCHA,
fait
Tom
état
Fletcher.
des engagements
He
pris par les
reported on the
autorités
commitments
émergentes en
made by the
faveur de
emerging
la protection des
authorities to
civils,
protect
de la
civilians,
continuation des services
to
essentiels,
continue essential
ainsi que pour
services,
l'ouverture
and
de tous
to
les points de
open all border
passage
crossings for
frontaliers pour l'aide
humanitarian
humanitaire.
aid.
Ces engagements
These
doivent être
commitments must be
concrétisés
put
et
into
maintenus
practice
dans
and
le temps.
maintained over time.
Madame la Présidente, en quittant le Conseil,
Madam
la
President,
Suisse
while
appelle
leaving
tous
the
les
Council,
membres à
Switzerland
poursuivre
calls
la
on
voie
all
qui
its
s'est
members
ouverte
to
le 8
pursue the
décembre
path
dernier
opened up on the
et
8th
dans
of
un même
December,
esprit de
and
coopération,
in the same
ainsi que
spirit
de
of
pleinement
cooperation, and to
soutenir
fully
une
support a
transition
political
politique
transition
qui soit menée
led
par
by
et pour
and
les
for the
Syriennes et
Syrians.
Syriens. La recherche d'une solution politique en
The
Syrie,
search for a
selon les
political
termes
solution in
adoptés par ce
Syria in the
Conseil,
terms
a trop
adopted by our
longtemps
Council
piétiné.
has stalled
Il
for
est
too
grand
long.
temps d'apporter un
It is
soutien
time
sans
for
équivoque en
unequivocal
faveur de la paix
support
et
for
de la
peace and
sécurité en
security in
Syrie
Syria
et dans la
and
région
in the
tout
region
entière.
as a
Je vous
whole.
remercie.
Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель,
Madam President,
благодарим
we would like to
спецпосланника
thank
Гейра
the
Педерсона и
special envoy
координатора
Geir Pedersen
чрезвычайной
and
помощи
the
Тома
emergency
Флетчера за их
relief
доклады.
coordinator Thomas Fletcher for their briefings.
Выслушали
We
оценку
also
председателя
heard the
Сирийского
assessment
комитета
by the chair of the Syrian
Батра
Negotiations
Джануса,
Committee, Mr.
а
Badr
также
Janus, and the
представительство
representative of the
гражданского
civil society, Ouad
Аль-Катаиб.
El-Khatib.
Внимательно следим за
We
развитием
follow very
ситуации в
closely the
дружественной нам
developing
Сирии,
situation in the brotherly country
которая
of
вступила в
Syria,
новый
which has entered
переходный
a new
период своей истории
transitional
после
period
перехода
over its
большей
history
части
after the
территории этой
major
страны
part
под
of its
контролем
territory
Альянса
came
вооруженных
under the
группировок.
control of the alliance of armed groups.
Очевидно, что
It is
предугадать
clear that
исход
predicting
и
today
политические,
the outcome and the
социально-экономические
political,
последствия
socio-economic
происходящих в этой стране
ramifications of
тектонических
developments
изменений
in this
было
country,
никто.
of the major tectonic shifts there, is
Мы
not
все
something anyone
надеемся на
can
лучшее.
do. We are all hoping for the best.
Хочу подчеркнуть,
But I would
что
like to
Российская
underscore that the
Федерация
Russian
всегда была
Federation
на
has
стороне
always been
братского
on the
сирийского
side of
народа,
the brotherly
которому мы
people
всегда
of Syria.
оказывали,
We have
оказываем и
always
будем оказывать
extended and we
необходимую
will
поддержку.
continue providing them with the needed support.
Именно сирийский
It
народ
is
во
the
всем его
Syrian
этноконфессиональном
people, in all of its
разнообразии, должен
ethnic
определять
and religious
будущее Сирии,
diversity, has
которая
to
сейчас весьма
decide the future of
неопределенна в
Syria, which
условиях
currently is
внутренней
quite uncertain
нестабильности,
given the
несущей
internal
осязаемую
lack of
угрозу ее
stability, which is fraught
суверенитету и
with palpable
государственности.
threats to its sovereignty and statehood.
Территориальная
The
целостность этой
territorial
страны
integrity
сейчас
of this
уязвима как
country is
никогда.
more vulnerable now than
Существует
ever.
реальный риск
There's a real
кантонизации
risk
Сирии
of
по этническому и
its
конфессиональному
becoming
признаку.
a number of cantons broken down by ethnic
Сирийцы
and religious
сегодня должны приложить
characteristics.
максимум
The
усилий для
Syrians today have
по-настоящему
made the
инклюзивного национального
utmost
диалога, в котором
efforts
не
to
будет
make sure there is an
разделения
inclusive
на
national
проигравших
dialogue
и
without
победителей.
separating people into losers and
Это очень
winners.
серьезная и
This
сложная
is a very
задача.
serious and
Международное
difficult
сообщество
task, and the
должно ей
international
серьезно
community has to do utmost to help this along.
Не менее острую угрозу
There's
сирийцам
an
несут
equally
сегодня
serious
действия
threat for the
Израиля,
Syrians,
который
which
под
lies
надуманными
in
предлогами
the
о
actions by
самообороне и
Israel, who,
обеспечении
using
своей
the artificial
безопасности, по
pretext
сути,
of self-defense
развернул
and
полномасштабную
protecting
операцию
their security,
по
essentially
уничтожению оборонного
is deploying a
потенциала этой
full-scale
страны.
operation to destroy the defense potential of the country.
ВВС Израиля
The
и
Air
ранее
Force of Israel,
наносившие интенсивные
and
произвольные
they used to
авиационные удары
also
с 8
conduct
декабря
arbitrary
осуществили по
airstrikes
имеющейся
in the
информации
past. But
свыше
as of the
500
8th of
авианалетов.
December, they have conducted more
В
than
результате были
500
практически
airstrikes.
уничтожены
As a
военно-морские
result,
силы,
the
90%
Navy
систем ПВО
of Syria was
и
destroyed,
ПРО
90% of air
Сирии и
defense and
половина
missile defense, and
военно-воздушных
half
сил Сирии.
of Syrian Air Force.
Кроме того, массированным
Additionally,
бомбардировкам
there
подверглись
are
комплексы
mass
зданий
bombardments
госсектора, а
of
также десятки
government
производственных и
buildings and
складских
dozens
объектов
of
в Дамаске,
industrial and
Сувейде,
storage
Дера,
facilities in Damascus,
Хомсе,
Suvey,
Тартусе,
Dera,
Латакии и
Homs,
Памире.
Tartus, Latakia, and Palmyra.
Idlib, Атанф,
Idlib,
Евфрат,
Atanf,
естественно,
and
остаются за спиной.
areas across the Euphrates are obviously outside of this
В
equation.
ночь на 14
In the
декабря
early
авиация
hours of the
Израиля
14th
нанесла
of
удар по
December,
объектам
the
в
Air Force of
столице на горе
Israel
Касьюн и
struck
уничтожил станцию радиоэлектронных
objects
борьбы.
in the city of Kasyun and destroyed an electronic warfare
В
station.
этом же ряду и наземные
There is
вторжения
also the
израильских
land
войск в районе
incursion by the
оккупированных
Israeli
сирийских
forces
голландских
in
высот, что
the
является грубым нарушением
occupied Syrian
положений
Golands,
соглашения о
with this
разъединении
gross
1974
violation of the
года,
provisions of the
открытым посягательством
disengagement
на
agreement of
суверенитет и территориальную
1974
целостность
and an
своего
open
соседа.
attempt on the sovereignty and
По
territorial
поступающей
integrity of a
информации,
neighbor.
израильские войска не
According
просто
to our
заняли
information, the
сирийскую сторону
Israeli
линии
forces are not not just occupying the Syrian side of this operation line. They've
Израильская
moved
военная
much
техника
further.
была
Israeli
замечена
military
чуть ли не на 20
equipment was
километрах от Дамаска.
seen almost 20 kilometers away from Damascus. The argument that the peacekeepers need to be protected sounds very cynical, given that the peacekeepers currently are essentially very deep behind Israeli lines. The capacity to effectively defend one's borders being attacked by Israel now is one of the basic factors of Syrian sovereignty. And we advocate that we call a spade and do not sweep under the carpet facts when they're inconvenient for West Jerusalem. If Israel wants to have good relations with neighbors, if Israel wants that, then they need to build this not from the position of force, but on an equal and mutually beneficial basis. Distinguished colleagues, one of the main tasks currently for us is safeguarding Syrian state institutions and making sure they function so as to provide everyday assistance to Syrians. It's important to make sure that the rules of basic law have primacy, that the civilians are protected, including the vulnerable categories, that there is civilian peace, national reconciliation, and to prevent vandalism, violence, and bloodshed. In this context, we note the statements made by the de facto authorities in Syria when they say that they intend to facilitate the work of government institutions, maintain the law and security, suppress criminal acts, prevent extrajudicial justice. We trust that these approaches will be supported by all interested Syrian parties. We would like to emphasize separately that Syria was a territory where for centuries Muslims and Christians lived together. And Damascus is a residency of the Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch and all of the East, John X. He is the head of the Antioch Church, which has a sisterly interaction with the Russian Orthodox Church. And we hope that Syria will continue being the homeland for all of its citizens, regardless of their religion. We are convinced that the pathway towards normalization in Syria is in inclusive inter-Syrian dialogue, taking into account the interest of all religious and ethnic groups of the society, when they aimed at attaining national harmony, comprehensive settlement process, and doing this in line with the basic principles in Security Council Resolutions 2254. We support efforts made by Geir Pedersen to have a national de-escalation in organizing a political process and doing this with the mediation and support from the UN. We remain convinced that there is a need to consolidate approaches by main international players aimed at creating conditions conducive towards stabilization of the situation. It is our view that the Special Envoy should play a leading role in coordinating this work. And in this context, we welcome your initiative, Gary, to convene an international conference on Syria and call upon all interested parties to support implementing this idea. When there are such dramatic changes in Syria, we think it would be premature to come up with optimistic forecasts or talk seriously about the improved humanitarian situation of the Syrians. We would like to see Syria prosper as well, but so far Syrians are still encountering a deep humanitarian crisis. 90% of people live in poverty. 70% of people need urgent food assistance. Inflation spikes and currency devaluation because of recent events aggravated the socioeconomic situation of Syrians. Some parts of Syria, bread prices have grown up by 900% since 27th of November. The disruption of logistic supply lines and the closure of borders means that there are fewer resources and lack of the means of sustenance. There is an acute issue having to do with the displaced persons. There is a trend for the refugees to come back, but there is also an outflow of people from the country. Since the moment of the increase in hostilities, more than 1 million people had to leave their homes. Most of these people are women and children, and there are very difficult conditions now within the country and outside of it. We also should remember those who recently fled Lebanon into Syria because of Israeli bombings. They need to be helped, and at the very least, they need to have their security ensured. Madam President, we are concerned by the news according to which the humanitarian activity is seriously limited. Humanitarians are telling us about the security issues, power cuts, and instances of
Дамаске,
looting.
в частности,
In Damascus,
разграблены
for
склады с
example,
гуманитарной помощью.
humanitarian assistance
Вместе с тем
warehouses
поддерживаем
have been
настрой
looted.
гуманитарных
At the same
структур ООН
time,
сохранить
we
свое
support
присутствие
the
на земле и
intent of
продолжать работу
humanitarian
по
UN
оказанию
agency to
содействия
continue
нуждающимся.
being on the ground and continue providing
Гуманитарный
assistance.
кризис в Сирии,
The
достигший
humanitarian crisis in
катастрофического
Syria,
уровня,
which
требует
reached a
срочных
catastrophic
и
level, something
скоординированных
that
действий
demands
всего
urgent and
международного
coordinated
сообщества.
action on the behalf
К
of the
сожалению,
entire
гуманитарный
international
призыв
community.
ООН по Сирии
Unfortunately, the
серьезным образом
humanitarian appeal
недофинансирован
on
и
Syria
выполнен
is
лишь
underfunded.
на треть,
It has only received
32%.
1/3 of the funding,
Хотели бы в этой
32%.
связи
In
обратиться
this
к так
regard, we
называемым
would like to
традиционным
address the
донорам с
so-called
вопросом.
traditional donors and
Будете
ask
ли
them
вы
a
и
question.
теперь,
Are you going
будете ли вы
to
теперь руководствоваться
now going to be
принципом
guided by the
гуманности и
principles of
беспристрастности
humanity and
в отношении
impartiality when
сирийского
it comes to the
гуманитарного
Syrian
досье?
humanitarian file?
Или, как и прежде,
Or will
продолжите
you, as
практику
before,
санкционного
continue the
удушения
practice of
сирийского
suffocating the Syrian people through
Санкции
sanctions?
необходимо снять,
Sanctions
потому
will
что
be
они, как
lifted
мы говорили
because
всегда,
they, and we've
бьют
always
по простым
said,
гражданам.
impact
Со
everyday
своей стороны
people. For our
продолжим
part, we will
оказывать
continue
помощь братскому
extending the
нам, сирийскому
assistance
народу.
to the
Благодарю вас.
brotherly people of Syria. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President.
Agradezco al enviado
I
especial
thank Special
Pedersen y al
Envoy
subsecretario
Pedersen
Fletcher
and
por la información
USG Fletcher
proporcionada,
for the information
pero
provided.
particularmente por el
But
valioso,
in particular, we thank
por la
them
valiosa
for
gestión que llevan adelante en este complejo escenario.
valuable work
He
that they're doing in this
escuchado con
complex scenario.
atención
And
a
I
la
listened
señora Al
closely
Khatib
to
y al
Ms.
señor
Al
Hamous,
Khatib
a
and
quienes
Mr.
también
Jamous,
agradezco.
and we also thank them for their
Expreso
statements.
la
I
solidaridad del
express
Ecuador con
the
el pueblo sirio
solidarity of
y su
Ecuador with the
aspiración por un
Syrian
verdadero
people and
futuro de
with
paz
its
y
aspiration for
desarrollo.
a true future of
El
peace and
escenario actual
development.
es una oportunidad
The
para
current scenario
restablecer el
is an
Estado de
opportunity to
Derecho,
restore the rule of
motivar
law,
la
to
reconciliación
encourage
nacional
national
y
reconciliation,
ofrecerle al pueblo
and to
sirio las
provide the
condiciones de
Syrian
bienestar y
people with the
seguridad
conditions
que
for
les fueron
well-being and
restringidas
security
en los
that
últimos
were
13
unavailable
años.
to them over the
El
last
Ecuador
13 years.
coincide con las palabras
Ecuador
del secretario
concurs with the
general
words
sobre
of
la
the
necesidad
Secretary
de
General on the
restaurar la
need to
soberanía, la
restore the
unidad, la
sovereignty,
independencia y
unity,
la integridad
independence,
territorial
and
de
territorial
Siria.
integrity of
Respalda
Syria.
asimismo el
Further,
mandato de UNDOF
we
y
support
reitera su posición
UNDOF's
de no
mandate,
reconocer
and
la
we
anexión
reiterate our
de
position that we
territorios
do
por la
not
fuerza.
recognize the annexation
Son
of territory by
encomiables
force.
los esfuerzos del
We
enviado
commend
especial
the
Pedersen
efforts
por
of Special
apoyar y
Envoy
asistir
Pedersen
en un
to
proceso de
support and
transición
assist with a
política
process
integral y
of a
participativa
comprehensive
basada en
and
los principios de
participatory
la
political
resolución
transition based on the principles of
2254,
Resolution
los cuales deben
2254,
respetarse en
which
línea con
should
lo
be
mencionado por el
respected in
enviado
line with what
Pedersen.
was mentioned
Durante
by
estos 2
Special
años
Envoy
hemos
Pedersen.
insistido en la necesidad
Over the
de
last
que
2
se
years, we
acate
have
el
insisted
derecho
on the need
internacional
to
humanitario
ensure
y
that
se
international humanitarian law is
privilegie el
complied
diálogo
with,
político
and the need
incluyente
to
y
favor an
participativo
inclusive, participatory,
liderado por Siria
Syrian-led
y con el
political
soporte de la
dialogue
región,
with the
de
support of the
Naciones
region,
Unidas
the United
y de la
Nations,
comunidad
and the international
internacional en
community
su
as a
conjunto.
whole.
Esta posición se
This
mantiene
position
invariable.
remains
Hacer
unchanged.
la posibilidad de diálogo una realidad
Turning
concreta
this
y
possibility for
sostenible,
dialogue
diálogo
into
basado en
a
una
tangible,
genuina
sustainable
preocupación por la
reality
población
based on
siria,
genuine
es un
concern for the Syrian
imperativo ético.
population is an
Señora
ethical
Presidenta,
imperative.
el
Madam
conflicto en
President,
Siria ha
the
tenido
conflict in
consecuencias
Syria has
devastadoras
had
para la
devastating
población civil.
consequences on the civilian
70% de
population.
la
70% of the
población en
population
necesidad de
is in need
asistencia
of humanitarian
humanitaria, 7
assistance.
millones de
There are
desplazados
7
internos,
million
medio millón de
IDPs,
niños con
half a
problemas
million
severos de
children are
malnutrición,
facing
son
severe
cifras que
malnutrition.
ilustran la
These
precariedad de las
figures speak to the
condiciones que
parlous
encaran
conditions
y la
in the country
urgencia de
and the
revertirlas.
urgent need to improve them.
Todas las modalidades
All
translineales y
cross-line and
transfronterizas para el
cross-border
acceso de la asistencia
modalities for the
humanitaria
access of
deben
humanitarian
mantenerse
assistance
operativas
must remain
para
operational
garantizar la
to
predictibilidad
guarantee
y
the predictability
sostenibilidad
and
de la
sustainability
asistencia
of humanitarian
humanitaria,
assistance,
adaptándola a la nueva realidad.
adapting it to the new
Las
reality.
hostilidades deben cesar para dar paso
Hostilities
al
must end
restablecimiento
to
de
enable
las más de
the
12,000
reopening
escuelas que
of the
fueron
more than
cerradas, la
12,000 shuttered
rehabilitación de los
schools,
sistemas de salud
the
y
rehabilitation
protección
of
y la
the health
reconstitución
and
de la
protection
infraestructura
systems,
civil
and the rebuilding
desmantelada
of
a causa del
the
conflicto.
civilian infrastructure
El
that was
Ecuador
decommissioned as
hace
a
un
result of the
llamado
conflict.
a las autoridades de
Ecuador
transición
appeals
sirias
to the
para
Syrian
que en las
transitional
actuales circunstancias
authorities
del país
to,
adopten
in
y
the current
apliquen las medidas
circumstances in the
que sean
country,
necesarias
take the necessary
para
steps to
impedir que
prevent
actores no
non-state
estatales
actors
accedan
from
y usen armas de
accessing and
destrucción
using
masiva
weapons of mass
en
destruction,
particular armas
particularly
químicas,
chemical
a la luz
weapons,
de la aplicación de las
pursuant to the
disposiciones de la
provisions
Convención
of
de Armas
the
Químicas
Chemical
y las
Weapons Convention
resoluciones
and the relevant
pertinentes
resolutions
del
of the
Consejo
Security
de
Council.
Seguridad. Señora Presidenta,
Madam President,
colegas, hoy más
colleagues,
que nunca
today more
es
than ever, it is
imprescindible
vital
facilitar el
to
acceso de la población
facilitate
a
the
mecanismos
population's
transparentes
access
de
to
rendición de
transparent
cuentas y robustecer
accountability
los esfuerzos para
mechanisms
obtener
and to step up
información
efforts
sobre
to
el
gather
destino de más
information
de
on the
100,000
fate of more than
personas desaparecidas.
100,000 missing
Al final
persons.
de nuestro periodo en el
At
Consejo
the
de
end of our
Seguridad,
term on the
la
Security
situación
Council,
ha
the
cambiado de una manera
situation has
inesperada.
changed in
Y
an
en este
unexpected
complejo
manner.
marco hacemos
And in this
votos por la
complex
priorización
context,
de un
we
verdadero diálogo
support the
de buena
prioritization of
fe,
a true good
así
faith
como
dialogue.
porque los
And we
canales de
hope that the
comunicación
channels of
y asistencia
communication
de la
and
comunidad
assistance from the
internacional
international
se
community
mantengan
will
abiertos
remain
para
open
apoyar a Siria
to
en la
support Syria
reconstrucción del
in
tejido social,
rebuilding its
la
social
creación de
fabric, in
instituciones
establishing
plurales,
plural
la paz
institutions,
y la
and
seguridad en
restoring
Siria
peace and
y en la
security in
región.
Syria and
Muchas
the
gracias.
region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the members of the A3+, namely Guyana, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and my own country, Algeria. At the outset, the A3+ would like to thank Mr. Peterson and Mr. Fletcher for their valuable briefings. We listened carefully to the representatives of the civil society. Madam President, our meeting takes place in a unique context. Syria. Syria, a nation exhausted by conflict, could choose the long road to peace. This situation brings immense hope for Syrians. However, it also causes significant concern as the fragile calm of recent days risk being disrupted, plunging Syria into a renewed crisis that no one wishes to see. The A3+ firmly believes that the time has come for a genuine Syrian-led and a Syrian-owned political process under the auspices of the United Nations for a new Syria that unites all Syrians. Yes, all Syrians, regardless of ethnicity or religious denominations. All Syrians, including women and young people, should be fully and meaningfully engaged in this political process. The involvement of the civil society is also key to ensuring a successful transition in Syria towards the realization of the aspirations of the Syrian people. In this regard, we fully support the efforts of the Special Envoy and urge the meaningful implementation of Resolution 2254, including the establishment of an inclusive transitional governing body with full executive power. We also stress the critical role of the United Nations at this juncture, underscoring that the Syrian people should be able to rely on the organization's support and expertise as they navigate the path ahead toward building a strong and sustainable culture of good governance. It is time for inclusivity, not division. It is time for inclusivity, not division. It is time for dialogue, not arms. It is time for dialogue, not arms. The A3 Plus reaffirms its unwavering commitment to Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity. We firmly reject any attempt to divide Syria. To move forward from its history of violence, Syria should not be an arena of polarization or rivalry of external powers. The A3 Plus stresses that only the Syrian people will freely decide the future of Syria. This fragile situation must not be exploited for the resurgence of terrorism. And in this context, decisive and collaborative action is therefore required. Furthermore, the A3 Plus reiterate that Syria's territorial integrity must be respected by all. And in this regard, we express our grave concern over the recent military incursions by the Israeli Defense Forces into Syrian territory, which constitute a flagrant violation of international law, a flagrant violation of the UN Charter. We emphasize the critical role of UNDOF in maintaining peace and stability in the region. And we also reject any unilateral actions undermining its mandate and its missions. The A3 Plus reaffirms the UN resolution related to the Golan Heights, underscoring that the Golan is a Syrian territory under occupation. And we call for full respect of the 1974 disengagement agreement, including the status of the area of separation. And we urge all parties to comply with their obligation in this regard. Madam President, the humanitarian situation in Syria remains dire, representing one of the most pressing challenges for the international community. Nearly 17 million people are now in need of assistance. And the latest developments have exacerbated the situation, with over 1 million people displaced in recent days. The A3 Plus express grave concern over these developments, and we call for broad mobilization to enable humanitarian actors to address the urgent needs of the population. Continued fighting, particularly in the northeast, will only worsen the humanitarian situation. We urge all parties to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, including those related to the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We call for an immediate nationwide ceasefire, to ensure freedom of movement for humanitarian actors. Unhindered humanitarian access must be guaranteed through all available mechanisms, including cross-border operations, to provide essential assistance to those in need. The A3+ calls upon donors to mobilize adequate funding for the humanitarian response plan in Syria. Increasing needs demand more resources. The Syrian people must not be abandoned. And we stress that the return of displaced Syrians to their home must be voluntary, must be safe, must be dignified. No one should be forced to return. Conditions must be created in Syria through early recovery and reconstruction to facilitate this process. Madam President, the latest developments in Syria have shown that unresolved crises do not simply fade away. They re-emerge. If a comprehensive and inclusive solution is not found for the situation in Syria, the repercussion will be disastrous for the region. For the A3+, it is the responsibility of the international community to stand with the Syrian people and help them build a brighter future for their countries. The international community should not repeat the mistakes made elsewhere in the region. The international community, I repeat, should not repeat the mistakes made elsewhere in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and USG Fletcher for their informative briefings. I also thank Ms. Wad Al-Khatib and Mr. Madar Jamas for their words. Since November 27th, we have witnessed rapid and dramatic changes in the state of affairs in Syria. Though it is premature to use concrete terms in relation to the de facto authority, we take note the current caretaker government has expressed its will for a smooth and peaceful transfer of power. In this regard, we appreciate the efforts made by Special Envoy Pedersen, including through meeting with Mr. Ahmed al-Sharara, Mr. Mohammed al-Bashir in Damascus, and other relevant counterparts. Japan is committed to backing the efforts of Syrian people to realize a political transition process in the spirit of the principles of the Security Council Resolution 2254, which leads to credible, inclusive, and non-sectarian governance. The future government must ensure respect for the rule of law and human rights, including women's rights. It also needs to provide protection to all Syrians, including religious and ethnic minorities. Madam President, there has been a success of reports of tragic traces of the atrocities committed by Assad regime, including torture in the detention centers such as Sednaya. The former regime must be held accountable for its crimes, and justice must be served. As the Special Envoy said, providing immediate and necessary support to the victims and their families is urgent. We uphold the roles of relevant bodies in this regard to shed light on what has happened and is happening in order to restore the dignity of detainees and determine the fates of the missing. Furthermore, we emphasize the importance of continuing our efforts with the OPCW and other partners to secure, declare, and destroy Syria's remaining chemical weapons stockpiles. We must prevent terrorists and extreme groups from acquiring any weapons of mass destruction. We must not forget those who are suffering as a result of nearly 14-year civil war. More than 70% of the population still needs humanitarian assistance, and the current upheaval has only increased this need. We understand that in some border areas, the movement of refugees returning to Syria has been observed. The authority must ensure conditions for safe, dignified, and voluntary returns of all those who were forced to flee the country. Madam President, Japan is concerned about the development of Israeli forces beyond the area of separation in the Golan Heights. Even though the Israeli government has stated the move is temporary and defensive measure, we believe that further explanation is required as to grounds for these military actions, including how they could be justified in relation to the 1974 disengagement agreement. Also, we are concerned about the recent announcement by the Israeli government to expand settlements in the Golan Heights, of which the government of Japan does not recognize the annexation by Israel. And such settlement activities are a violation of international law. Japan urges Israel to avoid any actions that would deteriorate the situation. The door to a new era is beginning to open. Beyond, there is a need to build a new nation that is open and truly a land of peace for the Syrian people. We cannot accept the occurrence of a new round of oppression, violence, or tragedy. The future of Syria should be determined by the Syrian people themselves. We stand with the people of Syria. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente, je voudrais d'abord remercier l'envoyé spécial du secrétaire général, M. Geir Peterson, et le secrétaire général adjoint, Tom Fletcher, pour leurs interventions, ainsi que M. Bader Jamous et Mme Ouad Al-Kateb pour leurs éclairages sur la situation actuelle et leurs témoignages. Madame la Présidente, une nouvelle phase historique s'ouvre pour la Syrie et le peuple syrien après la chute du régime de Bachar al-Assad. Après des années de répression brutale, de souffrance et de fracturation profonde, le temps de la réconciliation et de la reconstruction est venu en Syrie. Le temps de la justice aussi, pour des milliers d'hommes, de femmes et d'enfants victimes du régime. Ces 13 années de guerre civile laissent un pays exsangue, dont les besoins sont immenses. Une grande partie de la population a été contrainte de s'exiler loin de leur foyer. L'économie est à rebâtir, le pays est à reconstruire. Dans l'immédiat, la priorité doit aller à la cessation des hostilités dans tout le pays. Il faut sortir du cycle de la violence. tous les civils,
all of the
y
civilians,
compris les minorités
including
ethniques et
the
religieuses,
ethnic and
doivent être
religious
protégés
minorities, have to be
dans le respect
protected
du droit
in
international
line
des droits
with
de
the
l'homme.
international law and human
Le
rights law.
droit international
The
humanitaire
international
doit être respecté.
humanitarian law has to be upheld.
Nous avons pris note
We took note
des premières
of the
déclarations
initial
encourageantes
statements
de la
encouraging
part des
ones
autorités
made
de
by
facto
the de
à
facto
cet égard.
authorities in this regard.
La France, qui a des
France
attentes fortes
has
sur ces
very
sujets,
high expectations on
les
this
jugera
topic.
sur leurs actes
I will
et
judge
dans la durée.
them on their acts and over time.
L'aide humanitaire doit enfin
Humanitarian
parvenir à toutes les
assistance has
populations
to
civiles
finally be
qui en ont
supplied to
besoin en Syrie
all
et
of the
sur
people who
l'ensemble du
need it
territoire.
in Syria and throughout its territory.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam
il
President,
faut en parallèle
at
qu'un
the same
processus de transition
time,
politique
an orderly
ordonné
political
et
transition
représentatif de l'ensemble
has
des
to be
tendances de
started, a
l'opposition
kind of
syrienne
that represents all of the
et
trends
des
of
autorités
Syrian
de fait
opposition
se mettent
and
en
the de
place.
facto authorities.
Dans l'esprit de la
This is
résolution
to be done
2254
guided by the spirit of Resolution
et des grands principes
2254 and the
qu'elle établit,
major principles contained
en
therein,
préservant les
whilst
institutions de l'État.
safeguarding the state institutions.
Les Nations
The
Unies,
United Nations,
par l'intermédiaire de
through
l'envoyé
its
spécial du secrétaire général pour la
special
Syrie,
envoy of the
ont
Secretary
toute
General
leur
for
place
Syria,
pour faciliter ce
can
processus.
greatly help this process
Il faut
along.
que toutes les composantes de la
All
société
of the
syrienne se
components of the
retrouvent à la
Syrian
même table
society has
pour
to
discuter de l'avenir de leur pays.
be found at the same table so as to discuss the future of their country.
La relance d'un processus
Relaunching
politique
a political
qui devra
process
être mené
which has to
par les
be
Syriennes
led
et les
by the
Syriens,
Syrians
en
themselves.
particulier les femmes et les jeunes, doit permettre de
The women and
construire
the
un
young
futur qui
people
réponde
should
aux aspirations
allow the
légitimes
building
du
of the kind
peuple
of future
syrien
which
dans
meets the
toute sa
legitimate
diversité.
aspirations of the Syrian people in all of their diversity.
Ce processus
And this
implique de déboucher sur des
means
garanties
coming
en
up
matière des
with
droits de l'homme et de
guarantees
lutte
in
contre
terms of
l'impunité,
human rights and
en
fighting
particulier
impunity.
s'agissant des
In
personnes
particular,
disparues,
when it comes to the
torturées
disappeared, the
ou
tortured,
détenues
or
arbitrairement
those who
sous le
were
régime
arbitrarily
d'Assad.
detained under the Assad regime.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam
il sera
President,
aussi
it
fondamental
will
que la
also
nouvelle
be
Syrie
of
ne laisse
fundamental
pas la
importance
place
for the
à une
new Syria
résurgence
to
de
make sure
l'extrémisme
that there is no
et du
resurgence of
terrorisme
extremism
contre
and
lequel la lutte
terrorism.
doit se poursuivre.
And against these phenomena, the fighting has
compris
to
la lutte contre
continue,
Daesh.
including fighting Daesh.
La plus grande vigilance doit être aussi
Greatest
observée
kind of
s'agissant de
vigilance
la
also has to be
dissémination des
maintained
armes,
when it comes to the
en
proliferation
particulier
of
celles
weapons,
issues du
in
programme
particular
chimique
those
syrien.
which were within the Syrian chemical
La
program.
chute du régime de
The
Bachar
fall of
el-Assad
the Bashar al-Assad
offre
regime
l'opportunité
provides a
historique
historic
de détruire ces armes
opportunity
chimiques.
to destroy these chemical weapons.
Les autorités de fait
And
doivent
the
se
de
saisir de ce
facto
sujet et
authorities have
coopérer
to
avec
take
l'OIAC.
up this issue and cooperate with OPCW.
Dans le cadre de ce
Within the
processus,
framework
la
of this
France est prête
process,
à continuer à
France
venir en
is
aide au peuple
ready
syrien,
to
alors que
continue
les besoins
helping the
humanitaires
Syrian
restent
people
immenses.
when the
Dans l'immédiat,
humanitarian needs
il
are
est
so
vital que
high.
l'assistance
In the
humanitaire
short-term
parvienne de
perspective, it's
façon
vital to
sûre
make sure
à
that
tous les
humanitarian
Syriens et
assistance
par toutes les voies d'acheminement
arrives
possibles.
safely to all of the Syrians and using all possible
Enfin,
supply
la
routes.
France suit
And
avec préoccupation
finally,
les
let me
développements dans
say
le Golan.
that we follow with concern the
Elle appelle
developments in the
Israël
Golan.
à se
We
retirer de
call
la
on Israel
zone
to withdraw
et à rester pleinement
and to
et respecter pleinement
fully
l'accord sur le
uphold
dégagement
the agreement
de
on
1974,
disengagement of
lequel
1974.
doit être respecté
It has to
par ses
be
signataires,
upheld by
Israël
the
et la Syrie.
signatories, Israel and Syria.
La France renouvelle son
And we
plein soutien à la
renew our
FNUOD,
full support to
dont la
UNDOF,
sécurité doit être
whose
préservée.
security must be preserved.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President,
depuis 13 ans, la
for
France s'est
13
tenue aux
years
côtés du
now,
peuple
France
syrien dans
has
son
stood
combat pour la
by
liberté
the
et contre la
Syrian
barbarie.
people as they fought for freedom and against
Elle n'a
barbarie.
cessé et continue de
We
soutenir l'opposition
will
politique
continue,
syrienne, qui a un rôle central à
supporting
jouer
the Syrian
dans la
political
transition
process,
politique en
and
cours
this
à Damas.
process will have a
La
central
France
role to
continuera de se
play the
tenir aux côtés
political
du peuple
transition
syrien
in
dans
Damascus.
cette
France
phase
will
d'espoir
continue standing by
qui
the
s'ouvre pour
Syrian
lui.
people during
Je vous
this
remercie.
period of hope opening up in front of them. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，我要感谢裴凯如特使
I thank
和弗莱
Special
舍副
Envoy
秘书长的
Patterson
通报。
and USG Fletcher
我也
for
认
the
真听取
briefings.
了其他通报
I've
人的
also
发言。
listened attentively to the statements of other briefers.
近期叙利亚局势发生重大
Recently,
变
the
化，
situation in
中
Syria
方
has
对此
undergone
高度
drastic
关注。
changes, to which China
中方
pays
对叙
great
利亚
attention.
长期奉行
China has
友好
long
合作
pursued
政
a
策，
policy of friendship and cooperation
从不
with
干涉
Syria,
叙利亚内政，
not interfering in Syria's
尊
internal
重
affairs,
叙利亚人民
and
的选择。
respecting the choice of the Syrian people.
我们真诚希望
We
叙利亚
sincerely
尽快
hope
实现
that
和
Syria
平，
will achieve
恢复稳定，
peace and restore
愿为
stability
此
as soon as
发挥
possible,
建设性
and
作
we're
用。
ready to play a constructive role to
我
that
愿
end.
谈4点看法。
I wish to share the following 4 points.
第一， 当务
First,
之急是
it's
稳定
imperative
安
to
全形势。
stabilize the security situation.
我们呼吁
We
叙利亚
call
有
on
关各
all
方
parties
保持
concerned
冷
in
静克
Syria
制，
to exercise calm and
避免采取
restraint,
刺激局势升级
refrain
的
from
行动，
actions that may
防
escalate
止
the
引发
situation
新的冲
and
突。
prevent new conflicts.
各方有义务采取
All
措
parties
施，
are
杜绝
obliged to
一
take
切针对
measures to
平民的袭
prohibit
击，
attacks against
保护
civilians
外交机
and to
构
protect
和
the
外国
security
公
of
民的安全。
diplomatic missions and foreign
我们
nationals.
希望叙利亚的国
We
家机构
hope
保
that
持正
Syria's
常运作，
state
为
institutions
恢
will
复社
remain
会秩序
operational
创
to
造条
create
件。
conditions for the
希
restoration
望
of
有影
social
响力的
order.
国家，
And we
特
hope
别
that
是地区国
influential
家，
countries, especially
为稳
regional
定叙利
countries,
亚局
will
势
play a
发挥
constructive role
建设性
in
作用。
stabilizing the situation in Syria.
我们对近日以色列
We
持续对
express
叙利亚
our
发动
grave
空袭，
concern over
并
Israel's
进入
recent
戈兰地
continued
区，
airstrikes against
同
Syria
时声
and
称
its entry
将在
into the
戈
Golan
兰
region,
扩
as well
建
as
定
its
居点，
claim to
表示严
expand
重关切，
settlements in the Golan.
呼吁以
We
方
call on
停
Israel
止
to
上述行
stop
动。
these actions.
第二，
Second,
长久之计
the
是
long-term
推动政治
solution
解决。
is to promote a political
中方
settlement.
支持叙利亚
China
落实
supports
安理会第
Syria in
2254
implementing
号决
Security
议，
Council Resolution
按照叙人主导、
2254,
叙人所有的原
advancing
则，
its
推进
domestic
国内政治
political
进程，
process in line with the
通过包
Syrian-led
容
and
性对话
Syria-owned
找到
principle
重建
and
国家的
finding
方
a
案。
national reconstruction plan
国
through
际社会要
inclusive
切实维
dialogue.
护叙利亚
The
的
international
独立、
community should
统一、
effectively
主
safeguard
权和
Syria's
领土完整，
independence, unity, sovereignty, and
尊重叙
territorial
利亚的
integrity,
民族宗教传
respect
统，
Syria's
让
ethnic
叙利
and
亚人民
religious
自
traditions,
主
and
做出
allow
决
the
定。
Syrian people to make their own
要尊重
decisions.
叙利亚人民的意
The
愿，
will of the Syrian
避免
people
叙利亚
should be
国家分裂
respected，to avoid
国内
national
局势
division
出
and
现
the
碎片化。
fragmentation of the domestic situation.
中方支持联合
China
国
supports
积极发
the
挥
active
斡旋作用，
mediation role of the
支
UN
持裴凯如
in
特使
and
开展工作，
supports the work of
推动
Special
各方
Envoy
通过
Pedersen
对话协商，
in facilitating
达成
dialogue
兼顾
between all
各方
parties
利益的安
and
排。
reaching an arrangement that accommodates the interests of all
第三
sides.
明确底
Third,
线是
The
打
clear
击恐
bottom
怖主
line
义。
is the fight against
恐怖主
terrorism.
义是全人类的公敌，
Terrorism,
对
a
国际
common
和平
enemy
与
of
安全构成
mankind,
严重威胁。
poses a
未来
severe
的叙利
threat
亚
to
应
international
坚
peace
定
and
反
security.
对
The
任何形
Syria
式的
of the
恐怖主义
future
和
should
极端
stand
势力。
firm against any form of
叙利亚
terrorism
领
and
土
extremist
不得
forces.
被用
The
于支
Syrian
持恐怖主
territory
义，
must not be
威
used
胁
to
其他
support
国家的安
terrorism
全。
or threaten the
在
security
反
of
恐问
other
题上，
countries.
各国有义
On
务打击
counterterrorism,
包括东伊运
states have an
及
obligation to combat
突厥伊斯兰
all
党在
terrorist
内的
organizations
所有
listed
被安理
by
会
the
列
Security
明的
Council,
恐怖
including
组织。
the ETIM
国
or
际社会
TIP.
应当充分吸取
The
教训，
international community should
不能奉
draw
行双
full
重标准，
lessons and
不能搞
refrain from double
选择性
standards
使用。
and selective application.
第四，
Fourth,
各方责任是
it's
缓解
incumbent
人道
on all
局势。
parties to alleviate the
叙利
humanitarian
亚局势巨
situation.
变导
The
致
drastic
原本十
changes
分
in
严
the
峻的
situation
人
in
道危机
Syria
雪上
have
加霜。
exacerbated the already
中
dire
方赞赏联合
humanitarian
国机构
situation.
为恢复
China
灾区人道
appreciates the
行动
efforts made
所
by
做的
UN
努力，
agencies to resume
呼吁各
humanitarian
方履
operations
行国际
in
人道
Syria
法
and
义务，
calls on all parties to
确保
fulfill
不
their
受
obligations
阻
under
碍的
IHL,
人道准入，
ensure unimpeded
对联合
humanitarian
国机构
access,
开展人
and
道行动
facilitate
提
the
供便利。
humanitarian operations of UN agencies.
国际社会应共同
The
向叙利亚
international
示意援
community
手，
should
帮
lend
助
a
叙利亚
helping
改
hand
善
to
人道局
Syria
势
to。help improve its
有关国
humanitarian
家
situation.
长期对叙利亚
The
实施非法的单
protracted
边制裁，
unlawful unilateral
严重
sanctions
妨碍叙利
imposed
亚
on
经济
Syria
社会
by
发
some
展，
countries
对
which
叙利亚
have
人民造
severely
成极大
hampered
伤害，
its economic and
应
social
该
development
立即
and
解决。
caused tremendous harm to the Syrian people should be lifted
主席，
immediately.
加沙
President,
冲突爆发1年
for more
多
than a
来，
year since the
中东
outbreak
地
of
区
the
一
Gaza
波未
conflict,
平，
the
一波
Middle
又
East
起。
has witnessed
巴以、
relentless
黎
turmoil.
以、
Tensions have
伊以、
escalated in the
红海
Palestinian, Israeli,
紧张局势
Lebanese,
轮番
Israeli,
升级，
Iraqi, Israeli,
直至近期
Israeli,
叙
and
利亚
Red
局势
Sea
突变，
situations, coupled with the recent
中东
shift
地区
in the
动荡
situation
不
in
已，
Syria.
冲突频发，
The Middle
已
East
严重影
region
响
is
国际和
mired
平与
in
安全。
constant turbulence and frequent
这样的局
conflicts,
面如得不到
gravely
控
negatively affect
只
international
会
peace and
将越来越多的
security.
国
Such
家
a situation,
和
if
人民
left
投
unchecked,
入战
will
争的泥
only
潭。
drag more countries and peoples into the
国际社会应
quagmire
增
of
强紧
war.
迫感和责任感，
The international
共同
community should
寻找
work with a greater
冲
sense of
突降
urgency
级
and
的办法，
responsibility to seek
早日推动地区
de-escalation
重
of
归和
conflicts
平稳定。
and promote the early
为此，
return of
中方
peace
支
and
持安理会
stability to the
尽
region.
快
To
就
that
叙利亚
end,
局势
China
发声，
supports the Council in
传
speaking
递
out as soon as
致力于
possible
解
on
决
the
叙利亚
situation
问
in
题的积
Syria,
极信号，
sending a positive
体
signal
现
of
安理
commitment
会的
to
重
resolving
要
the
作用。
Syrian issue and
最
reflecting
后，
its
我要重
important
申，
role.
作为中
In
东国家的
conclusion,
战略
I
伙
wish
伴
to，reiterate
中
that
方
as
愿
a
意从
strategic
国际社
partner
会一
of the
道，
countries of the Middle
继续
East,
为推动
China
叙
is
利亚
ready
实
to
现
work with the
长治久
international
安、
community to
中
continue
东
to
地
make
区
unremitting
恢
efforts
复
to
和
promote
平与
long-term
安宁
stability in
做出
Syria
不
and
懈
the
的努力。
restoration of peace and tranquility
谢谢
in
主
the
席。
Middle East. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I would also like to thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and USG Tom Fletcher for their comprehensive briefings. I also thank Ms. Al-Khatib and Mr. Jamus for sharing their personal stories and insightful observations. After 13 years of devastating civil war, Syria has demonstrated that the Syrian-led political transition, once dismissed by some as a hollow ambition, is now proving to be an achievable goal. However, how we navigate this transformative juncture will determine whether Syria can rebuild itself as a legitimate state for all Syrians. Let me highlight the following points in this regard. First, the caretaker government should ensure a peaceful power transition through a political process based on the principles enshrined in Resolution 2254. The keys here are legitimacy and inclusiveness. We note the Prime Minister's statement that his term will last until March 1st of next year. His emphasis on the caretaker mandate's temporary nature is a good start, and we look forward to a peaceful, free, and fair elections as early as practicable. Sustainable governance for Syria, a multi-ethnic and multi-sectarian state, inherently requires inclusivity. No community or group, including ethnic or religious minorities and women, should be excluded. In this regard, we note with deep interest the caretaker government's commitment to social reconciliation and cohesion among all communities, and we look forward to seeing these commitments translated into tangible actions. Second, all hostilities throughout the country must cease in order to stabilize Syria and safeguard its territorial integrity at this critical juncture. Especially, intensified hostilities in northern Syria, Golan incursions, and Israel's airstrikes across the country are deeply concerning. Even more disturbing is Israel's plan to expand its settlement in the occupied Golan Heights, contrary to its obligations under the Geneva Conventions and the Security Council Resolution 497. Exploiting Syria's turmoil for territorial gain is unacceptable. All parties must respect relevant agreements, including the 1974 disengagement agreement and the last week's SNA-SDF ceasefire agreement. Third, Syria's deteriorating humanitarian situation should be urgently addressed. Pressing challenges, including winterization needs and large population flows in the wake of the sudden downfall of Assad, call for swift and enhanced international assistance on the ground. For its part, the Republic of Korea contributed $26 million to mitigate suffering of Syrians this year so far. Meanwhile, indications of revitalizing economic activity and the resumption of public services require a fresh approach to help this transition. Jobs, clean water, education, healthcare, and public safety are all critical for uniting communities, rebuilding the nation, and laying the foundation for the voluntary return of Syrian refugees. In this regard, we welcome the early recovery strategy announced by OCHA last month and look forward to its effective implementation, not only addressing the imminent humanitarian crisis, but also fostering long-term resilience. Fourth, justice and reconciliation must anchor Syria's new political order. Colombia's experience over the last decade illustrates the complexities of implementing inclusive transitional justice and underscores the absolute necessity of such efforts for enduring peace. In this vein, we keenly note the caretaker government's amnesty decree for conscripted soldiers, while at the same time proclaiming that it will prosecute war criminals. In this connection, ongoing actions to clarify the fate of missing persons are critical. While the liberation of Sednaya prison is an extremely painful reminder of the Assad regime's barbaric brutality, more than 100,000 missing persons remain tragically unaccounted for. As the Independent Institution on Missing Persons in Syria, IIMP, emphasized in its statement last week, all parties on the ground must submit any relevant information to the IIMP to help clarify the fate and the whereabouts of the missing Syrians. Last but not least, transitional authorities must fully cooperate with the OPCW to ensure accountability for Syria's past use of chemical weapons, a long-standing expectation of this Council. At the same time, substantial quantities of chemical weapons remain unaccounted for, posing grave risks to regional security, particularly amid the current power vacuum. We note with expectation the caretaker government's expressed willingness to collaborate with the OPCW and urge it to strictly honor its own commitment. Meanwhile, we note the OPCW Director General's remark that airstrikes targeting facilities not only bear the risk of contamination, but also jeopardize the destruction of valuable evidence for investigations related to past use of chemical weapons. Madam President, in conclusion, the Republic of Korea hopes this historic positive momentum should not only be preserved, but also fortified, so that the Syrian people can reclaim their future. Let us stand united for a dignified, stable, and peaceful future for all Syrians, underpinned with basic human rights and fundamental freedoms. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. At the beginning, I'd like to express our gratitude to both briefers, as well as to Ms. Al-Khatib and Mr. Jamous for the valuable contributions. Special Envoy Pedersen, my country greatly appreciated your voice after the fall of the Assad regime, as well as your engagement with the caretaker authorities in the days that followed. Madam President, colleagues, the transfer of power in Syria carries profound emotional weight for the nation that has endured years of conflict, years of loss and fractured unity. For many, the idea of change is both a beacon of hope and a source of anxiety. It symbolizes the possibility of healing a war-torn country and a rebuilding of a future rooted in dignity and justice. Yet it also brings deep fears of continued instability, reprisals, and the resurfacing of old wounds. Today, Syrians find themselves at a crossroad, entering uncharted waters, filled with hope. Hope that their legitimate aspirations to live a life in peace, freedom, and prosperity could be realized at last. In this regard, Madam President, I'd like to make the following remarks. First, prosperous future depends on a credible and inclusive political transition, an inclusive Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process, which should take place in line with the key principles of the Resolution 2254. In this regard, I'd like to emphasize that women must be able to participate fully, safely, and meaningfully in all processes. While doing so, Syria must abide by all relevant resolutions of the Council. We're especially stressing all parties' obligations related to the fight against terrorism. In particular, we'd like to underscore the importance of preventing the Islamic State and other groups from re-establishing their capabilities and denying them safe haven in Syria. The caretaker authorities must also respect Syria's other international obligations, including the Chemical Weapons Convention. Second, years of hostilities across all of Syria have exacerbated humanitarian needs. We join others in urging for additional international support for the efforts of the United Nations and humanitarian organizations to surge humanitarian aid to support civilians in need across Syria. We expect the caretaker authorities to hold true to their commitments of ensuring full humanitarian access and the continuity of essential services. All efforts should be accompanied by preventing further displacement and disruption of humanitarian access. Third, we call upon all states to ensure all those responsible for the crimes committed are held accountable. It is equally important that evidence of atrocities is preserved and documented. We call on all parties to cooperate fully with the independent institutions of missing persons, which we hope will be operational as soon as possible, the international, impartial, and independent mechanism, and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria. Survivors, victims, and their loved ones deserve justice, truth, and reparations. Accounting for the missing and ensuring that families receive the clarity and recognition they desperately need should be a priority. Sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and unity of Syria are imperative. We echo Secretary General's concern about the recent extensive violations of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. There is no way around the 1974 disengagement agreement, including the principles regarding the area of separation that must be fully respected and implemented. Slovenia fully supports UNDOF and the implementation of its mandate. Madam President, the people of Syria deserve justice, peace, and stability, but they also deserve much more. After more than 50 years of the rule of the Assad family, they deserve a peace of mind that history will not repeat itself. The change that this transition brings should not only shift Syria away from the violent conflict, but also from the decades of repression and atrocities. Actions by the de facto authorities showing full respect for international humanitarian and human rights law would be an indispensable first step in this direction. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Madam President. And I also thank Special Envoy Peterson, ERC Fletcher, Ms. Al-Khattab, and Brother James for their updates today. After nearly 14 years of brutal conflict, which culminated in the collapse of the Assad regime, the Syrian people can finally hope again. Malta extends its heartfelt support to Syrians all over the world as they celebrate this remarkable development. Over the past 2 years, Malta has called on all parties, including representatives of the former regime, to engage in the Constitutional Committee. We implored the need for inclusive reform, elections, transitional processes, and genuine accountability in shaping a new Syria. Regrettably, the Assad regime declined and instead imposed years of anguish on the Syrian people. Political prisoners languished in secret detention and torture facilities. Humanitarian aid was subverted and withheld. Millions were displaced and made refugees. President, in our first statement to the Council, we reflected on the acute humanitarian needs across Syria, the economic crisis, major food insecurity, and the lack of medical staff, drugs, and safe facilities. We addressed the cholera outbreak and the importance of the humanitarian cross-border mechanism. We bore witness to the extension of the Council's mandate to allow cross-border aid into Syria, the eventual veto, and the transition to a direct agreement between Damascus and the UN. Regrettably, the humanitarian needs remain as significant now as they were when we first took our seat on the Council. Now, with the humanitarian access being at its greatest point in comparison to any other time during the conflict, greater resourcing and attention to early recovery, resilience, and livelihoods programs is vital. In this regard, we also take note of the commitments made by the interim government to enable and protect UN and humanitarian staff and operations. Across the country, land must be cleared for planting. Farmers must have access to irrigation systems, tools, and seeds to prepare for next year's harvest. After so much destruction, our collective focus now must be to rebuild. President, Malta stresses in the strongest terms the importance of an orderly, peaceful, and inclusive political transition. While there has been cause for great optimism, significant concerns remain regarding reprisal attacks and a backslide into autocratic and radical governance. First, the rights of women and all minorities, including religious minorities, must be ensured. This is the foundation upon which Syria can rebuild and emerge from the rubble. Second, continued progress towards a stable interim government is key. From there, re-engagement with Resolution 2254 presents a credible roadmap for a new, inclusive political horizon. It provides a path where all Syrian stakeholders, including civil society, can engage to positively transform Syrian society and unlock the political support of the international community for rebuilding efforts. Third, the continued presence and operations of UNDOF, especially at this time of grave instability, cannot be underestimated. We remain strongly supportive of UNDOF and full compliance with the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement. The illegal seizure of Syrian territory is unacceptable and risks reigniting the flames of conflict. Syria's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity must be respected. Fourth, justice and accountability are the basis of any lasting peace. The scenes we witnessed last week from the Sednaya prison are horrifying. We must tread carefully and work systematically to reunite families with detained loved ones where possible. We must equally continue to establish the fate of the missing and those who will never return. In this respect, the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic are more critical than ever. President, from the very start of our term, we pledge to be guided by the needs of the Syrian people. At this historic juncture, we stand by Syrians at home and throughout the world as they reclaim their country, sovereignty, and dignity. We remain committed to healing wounds and bridging divides in the weeks, months, and years ahead. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Under-Secretary General Fletcher for their briefings. I also thank Dr. Jamous and Ms. Al-Khatib for their very powerful briefings on the next steps needed for Syria. Colleagues, this is a moment of hope and a new chapter for the Syrian people. They suffered enormously under the Assad regime's cruel grip. It is a moment to mourn and seek accountability for those who've been lost, and a chance to ensure that the nation handed down to future generations is one built on democracy, stability, and peaceful coexistence. I will focus on 3 points addressing the transition period, humanitarian support, and accountability. First, the transition period. We cannot underestimate the challenge ahead. The UK, alongside the UN and our Arab, US, and EU partners, has been clear that the Syrian people have our full support as they proceed with the momentous task of building their future. We call on the new interim authorities to support an inclusive political dialogue on Syria's future governance, protect the rights of all individuals, respect international humanitarian law, and develop a process of equitable justice and accountability. We will judge them by their actions. The world is watching. Of course, the fall of Assad does not mean that security in Syria will automatically improve. We must remain seized of the threat of a Daesh resurgence. The UK is fully committed to supporting Syria's fight against terrorism. Respect for Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity is crucial for the peace and security of the region. We call on all parties to cease hostilities in Syria. Second, humanitarian support. This is an opportunity to end the suffering that Syrians have endured for far too long. We welcome the positive engagement that the Emergency Relief Coordinator has had in Syria with the new interim authorities. We have seen millions of Syrians displaced from their homes without proper access to food, medicine, basic services, or an education for their children. For those returning home and seeking to rebuild their lives, the international community must stand together to support their immediate needs. In the past week, the UK has announced an additional $78 million aid package to support the most vulnerable Syrians, including Syrian refugees across the region. Third, accountability. We stand with the hundreds of thousands of Syrians who were arbitrarily detained, tortured, and murdered at the hands of the regime. We also remember the men, women, and children of Ghouta, Douma, and Khan Sheikhoun, victims of Assad's horrific use of chemical weapons. We, the international community, must continue to pursue accountability for these atrocities, including the preservation of records alongside full implementation of Resolution 2118. The UK has provided a further $150,000 to the OPCW Syria missions to help rid Syria of its chemical weapons stockpile once and for all. President, as we look to 2025 and beyond, we call on the international community to come together and support Syria as it seeks the future it has waited for, the future it has fought for, and the future it deserves. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I will now make a statement in my national capacity. Thank you, Special Envoy Pedersen and Undersecretary General Fletcher, for your briefings and also for your recommendations. And thank you, Badr Jamous and Waad Al-Khattab, for your powerful statements and your relentless efforts to advance peace and security in Syria for the Syrian people. Colleagues, at long last, the Assad regime has fallen, and the Syrian people are seeing their first glimpse of freedom in decades and are experiencing their first glimmer of hope. That includes thousands of political prisoners who have spent years and years locked away by the regime. Syrians like Qasim Sobi El-Kabalani, who shared his story with the BBC last week. Qasim was arrested by the regime in 2016 and eventually sent to Saadnaya, to the prison which has been described as a human slaughterhouse. There he was subject to unthinkable horrors, including torture. And after so much abuse, it was nearly impossible for him to imagine his release. But now Qasim is free and feels like he has been granted a new lease on life. Colleagues, all of Syria has a chance for a new beginning. This is a historic opportunity for the long-suffering people of Syria to build a better life. After more than a decade of conflict and corruption, their needs are extensive, and the United States is committed to mobilizing global support. Last week, Secretary Blinken, together with our partners in the Aqaba Joint Contact Group, announced a set of principles that will help guide international efforts to support the Syrian people as they write their next chapter. And let me be clear, it is theirs to write. It would be a waste of this historic opportunity if one tyrant were toppled only to see a new one rise up in his place. Therefore, we fully support a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political transition in which the spirit of Resolution 2254 that will lead to credible, inclusive, and non-sectarian governance for the benefit of all Syrians, as we heard stated by Mr. Pedersen earlier today. Together with our partners, we will engage with Syrian groups to support an independent and sovereign Syria that respects human rights, including the rights of minorities and women, and that upholds international humanitarian law. The U.S. and our partners also agreed that Syrian state institutions should deliver essential services to its people. Colleagues, in recent days, we have seen the emotional scenes of missing and disappeared family members being reunited with their loved ones. Determining the fate of missing Syrians and foreign nationals is of vital importance, because while Qasim and thousands of others are now free, so many families are still in the dark. That includes the loved ones of U.S. citizen Austin Tice, who was taken captive more than 12 years ago. We will not rest until Austin is home, and we are pressing all parties in Syria to help make this happen. The United States appreciates the work of civil society groups, the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, and Commission of Inquiry, which continue to document regime violations and abuses. As the independent institution on missing persons mission has never been more crucial, we encourage the Secretary General to appoint a head of the IIMP as soon as possible. Our support and funding of this work must continue. Colleagues, the regime may have fallen, but the dire humanitarian needs of millions of Syrians remain, as you've heard from all of our speakers today. In addition to ensuring unhindered access from neighboring countries and throughout Syria, we call for additional financial support for UN agencies and aid organizations. This includes additional contributions to the Syria Recovery Trust Fund. I've often spoken about the Syrians forced to flee the violence and destruction of the regime. Now, so many refugees are eager to return home and help rebuild their country. Many displaced Syrians in host countries still require protection and basic services. Indeed, some Syrian refugees and asylum seekers may be even more vulnerable. And so all states must uphold their obligations to refugees. Colleagues, just as Syria's leaders should no longer pose a threat to their own people, Syria should have peaceful relations with its neighbors. The United States will continue to support Syria's neighbors, including Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Turkey, and Israel, should any new threats arise from Syria during this period of transition. Preventing these threats requires that Syria cooperates with efforts to secure and destroy its remaining chemical weapons stockpiles. Consistent with the obligation under the Chemical Weapons Convention and Security Council Resolution 2118. We seek assurances of Syria's commitment to cooperate with the OPCW in this regard. Finally, there is a strong international consensus that Syria must not be used as base for terrorists such as ISIS. That requires securing detention facilities and displaced persons camps in northeast Syria, which hold nearly 9,000 ISIS fighters. And that means continuing to repatriate detained and displaced foreign nationals. As the United States maintains our mission against ISIS, there should be no doubt we will fully defend and protect U.S. personnel and U.S. military positions in northeast Syria. Colleagues, for so long, it might have seemed that Assad's violent, repressive tactics would pay off, that his grip on power was unshakable, especially since Russia did everything in its power to prop up Assad's brutal regime. And unlike what we heard the Russian PR say about supporting the Syrian people, Russia actually targeted Syrian civilians. Russia obstructed cross-border humanitarian assistance, and now Russia is offering safe haven to Syria's deposed dictator. But Russia's and Assad's campaign of cruelty ultimately failed. The regime has fallen, and Syria has a chance for a new beginning. Going forward, we must demonstrate the Council's unity in support of the Syrian people. For even as we are clear-eyed about the challenges ahead, we are determined to stand with the Syrian people. We are determined to stand with the Syrian people as they write what we hope will be a peaceful, prosperous next chapter. Thank you very much. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of Iran.
Okay. Thank you, Madam President. In the name of God, the Compassionate and Merciful, we thank Mr. Peterson, the Special Envoy, and Mr. Fletcher and the Secretary General for their insightful briefings. We listened carefully to a statement made by the other briefers. Regarding the recent development in Syria, I would like to make the following key points. First, the Islamic Republic of Iran reaffirms its unwavering support for Syrians' unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. The future of Syria must be decided solely by its people, free from external interference or imposition. An inclusive Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process facilitated by the UN and grounded in the framework of the Resolution 2254 is essential. This includes drafting a new constitution through a representative constitutional committee and establish an inclusive and representative government that reflects the aspiration of all Syrian people. In this context, Iran commends the constructive effort and active engagement of the UN Special Envoy, Mr. Peterson, in advancing this critical objective. Second, maintaining Syrian governmental institutions is vital for stability and the foundation of an inclusive political solution. Institutional collapse risks further fragmentation, humanitarian suffering, and exploitation by extremists. Lessons from the past conflict underline the importance of institutional continuity for basic services, the rule of law, and trust building. The international community must support Syria's institutional resilience, respecting its sovereignty and the will of its people. Third, the safety of all Syrian citizens, including the rights of minorities as well as foreign nationals, must be ensured. Religious and cultural sites and places must be safeguarded, and the inavailability of diplomatic premises and personnel must be upheld in accordance with international law. Fourth, Iran strongly condemns Israeli continued violation of Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Israeli occupying regime has exploited the current situation in Syria to pursue its political agenda and further destroy Syria's infrastructure. The Security Council must take decisive action to address this aggression and to put an end to Israeli occupation of Syrian territory, which constitute a blatant violation of international law, the UN Charter, and the Council's own resolution, in particular Resolution 350. Iran reaffirms its unwavering support for UNDOF and the full implementation of its mandate. Fifth, the Syrian people face immense economic and humanitarian hardship that demand urgent action. Rebuilding critical infrastructure, restoring services, and ensuring the safe return of refugees and internally displaced persons are essential for fostering national unity and recovery. Immediate aid must be prioritized and unilateral sanctions on Syria must be lifted. The continuation of these inhuman and illegal measures is unjustifiable, as they disproportionately harm the most vulnerable, worsen economic hardship, and violate the fundamental rights of the Syrian people. Iran commends the tireless efforts of OCHA and its humanitarian partners in their work toward alleviating the suffering of the Syrian people. Sixth, Syria remains a pivotal country in the region and must recover its vital role in promoting peace and stability, free from terrorism that poses no threat to its neighbors or the broader region. The Syrian people deserve peace, dignity, and the chance to rebuild their nation free from external interference. The international community must collectively support Syria's unity, sovereignty, and reconstruction, ensuring the rights of aspiration of all Syrians are upheld. Seventh, Iran has consistently played a pivotal and constructive role in promoting regional peace and security, paying a heavy price both in material and human cost in fight against terrorism in Syria and the wider region. This undeniable reality cannot be overlooked. For years, Iran has provided legitimate support to Syria in its fight against terrorism, acting upon the formal and unlawful request of the then Syrian government. Without Iran and the Hezbollah decisive efforts and sacrifices, Syria would have fallen entirely under the control of Daesh and its affiliated terrorist groups, with their influence potentially extending into Lebanon. These efforts also played a critical role in bringing to end to Daesh control in both Iraq and Syria. Finally, Iran and Syria share deep historical and friendly relations, which continue to grow based on mutual interest and international legal principles. Iran remains steadfast in its constructive role working with the United Nations, regional partners, and the Syrian people to achieve lasting peace and stability in Syria and the wider region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Iraq.
شكرا جزيلا السيد الرئيس على عقد هذه
الجلسة
لمناقشة الأوضاع في الجمهورية العربية السورية ونعرب عن تقديرنا للجهود التي يبذلها مجلس الأمن والأمين العام في متابعة الأوضاع في سوريا وفي دعم الشعب السوري ولمعالجة الأزمة السورية التي طالت معاناة شعبها خلال
in the Syrian crisis that has caused so much suffering for the Syrian people over the last few years. This based on our humanitarian and regional responsibility to support efforts to restore peace and stability in Syria and across the region. We would like to thank Mr. Pedersen, the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, and Mr. Fletcher, the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. We thank them for their briefings. Likewise, we listened closely to the statements by Mr. Mohammed Al-Khatib and Mr. Jamous. Since the beginning of the Syrian crisis in 2011, Iraq has continued to call for a political dialogue between all of the Syrian parties. This is the only way to resolve this crisis. We believe that a political solution must be based on the willingness of the Syrian people and must be Syrian-led without any foreign interference. Further, we are aware that only the Syrian people has the right to decide on its own future and to choose its leaders through a democratic process that reflects the aspirations of the Syrian people and which ensures its rights, freedoms, and we reaffirm that the stability of Syria is an integral part of the stability of the region. Therefore, we call on the international community to step up its efforts to assist the Syrian people in overcoming this test by providing humanitarian assistance or participating in reconstruction. Any solution to address the repercussions of the regime change must be based on a constructive dialogue in order to ensure that there is a political, economic, and humanitarian response that ambassadors not suffer any foreign interference. We would like to reaffirm the following points. Firstly, it's important to respect the willingness of the Syrian people and its right to decide on its future freely without any foreign interference. We must ensure its right to decide on its leaders. Following the regime change in Syria, the current juncture calls for a balanced, comprehensive approach to achieve peace and stability in Syria after so many years of conflict. We call for support for the Syrian people in all of its component parts through an inclusive approach that takes into account all of the parts of Syrian society without any exclusiveness. We must ensure peaceful coexistence between all of these component parts of the Syrian population to ensure that they're represented with rights for respect for human rights and women's rights. We must further seek to achieve a stable and prosperous state. Secondly, we must support an inclusive, fair political regime based on particularly Resolution 2054 of the Security Council to guarantee a peaceful political transition in line with the aspirations of the Syrian people. We must also develop a clear roadmap to ensure a peaceful political process, ensuring the effective involvement of all Syrian forces and to strengthen the Syrian state institutions. Thirdly, we must preserve the unity of the Syrian people, the unity of the country and its territorial integrity. We reject any attempt to divide Syria, violate its sovereignty, or establish hotbeds of influence subject to regional actors. This would destabilize Syria and the region. We must further ensure that Syria will be united and sovereign and will benefit from the unity of its territory. We further call on all Syrian stakeholders to overcome their divisions and to work together to create a political regime reflecting the aspirations of the Syrian people across all of its component parts. We must address the humanitarian situation and improve the humanitarian situation of the Syrian people by providing the necessary humanitarian aid, by supporting their reconstruction and bringing an end to the isolation of Syria, and ensure that they can return home safely and in dignity. We must ensure safety with regard to their return. We also recall the importance of international and regional cooperation to combat terrorism, which remains a threat to Syria and the region. Syria must not be transformed into a haven for terrorist organizations or a crossing point for terrorist organizations. We are very concerned by the increasing threat of terrorist organizations in Syria and the region because they take advantage of the lack of peace and stability to expand their scope of influence. This has a direct effect on neighboring countries. We must also support the efforts of the Special Envoy, and we call on all to support the efforts of the Special Envoy to ensure that we can comply with Resolution 2254. We further call for strengthened United Nations presence on the ground. The Republic of Iraq condemns and firmly denounces the decision by the Israeli entity to expand its settlement building in the occupied Syrian Golan. This represents a serious violation of international law and the international resolutions. We reiterate our unchanged position and the right of the Syrian people to its sovereignty across all of its territory. The Golan is an occupied Syrian territory. Any attempts to change its demographic makeup is null and void. We also call on the international community to work seriously to preserve the unity and sovereignty of Syria and to achieve peace and stability across the region. We call on the Security Council to shoulder its responsibility to take the necessary steps to bring an end to these violations, which are benefiting from the current situation in Syria. We reaffirm that it's important to respect the disengagement of forces agreement of 1974 and to ensure the continued presence of UNDOF on the ground. UNDOF plays an essential role to preserve stability and ensuring de-escalation in the region. In conclusion, we remain ready to work with all parties in the region to preserve the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria and to ensure a dignified future for its people. We call for pooled international efforts to support Syria and its people during this stage and to overcome political, human and security challenges. We stand ready to cooperate with all parties to achieve this noble aim, and we urge all Syrian stakeholders to overcome their differences and to work together to build a political regime reflecting the aspirations of the Syrian people in all of its component parts. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Iraq for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Madam President. I am also grateful to Special Envoy Pedersen and the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Fletcher, for their briefings, as well as Mr. Jamuz, Chairman of the Syrian Negotiations Commission, and Ms. Al-Khatib for their interventions. And I really congratulate them for conveying voice of their people during these hardship 14 years to the international community. The Syrian people are at a pivotal moment in their history. As of December 8, Syria entered a new era, one that carries the potential to transform a decade of conflict and suffering into a future marked by peace, stability, and prosperity. After 14 years of unimaginable pain, the Syrian people are closer than ever to realizing their aspiration for a free and inclusive Syria. However, the road ahead is not without its challenges. The next steps should be critical to rebuild a Syria that is united, inclusive, and stable, a Syria that can contribute to the stability of our entire region. Madam President, the primary responsibility for this transition rests with the Syrian people themselves. Their ownership of this process is paramount. And as a diplomat, Turkish diplomat who served in Damascus before, I am very confident on this. A credible and legitimate transition, a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned process will require bold, inclusive, and determined steps towards national unity. Inclusivity must lie at the heart of Syria's future. A new Syrian government must reflect the voices of all segments of society. This is not just a moral imperative, it is a strategic necessity. Only an inclusive and representative political framework can foster the long-term harmony required to build a united Syria. Equally, the territorial integrity of Syria must be safeguarded under all circumstances. The fragmentation of Syria would not only jeopardize the country's future, but also destabilize an already fragile region. A united Syria must emerge as a place where all its people can coexist peacefully without fear of sectarian strife or discrimination. Respect for all segments of society and the rejection of sectarianism must remain guiding principles. Madam President, for over a decade, Turkey has stood by the Syrian people, offering unwavering support to both those within Syria and the millions forced to seek refuge beyond the borders. Turkey has hosted 4 million Syrians, providing them with safety, education, and livelihoods. This is not just a testament to Turkey's solidarity, but also a recognition that Syria's stability is critical for the stability of the region. The international community must now match this commitment. The devastation brought by years of conflict cannot be overcome by Syrians alone. We need swift actions in the political and humanitarian fields. The matter of sanctions needs to be addressed. This is essential for a self-sustained, functioning state. A comprehensive recovery plan, supported by international assistance and resources, is urgently needed to alleviate suffering, rebuild the infrastructure, and create conditions for the safe, voluntary, and dignified return of millions of displaced Syrians. Turkey, for its part, has already reactivated its embassy in Damascus as a step toward fostering a constructive dialogue during this transition. Madam President, stability in Syria cannot be achieved without addressing the persistent threat of terrorism. Syria must not become a haven for terrorist groups that exploit the transition period to further their agenda. In particular, PKK, YPG, and the so-called SDF and its affiliates remain a grave threat not only to Syria's unity and security, but also to Turkey's national security and the broader region. Their attacks, including those targeting Arab-majority regions, such as Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, highlight the urgency of eradicating these groups to ensure the safety of all Syrians. While the transitional process must be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned, it cannot include actors like PKK, YPG, SDF, whose actions undermine Syrians' territorial integrity and stability. Turkey will continue to take preventive measures to protect its borders and prevent these groups from exploiting the situation on the ground. Madam President, Turkey remains deeply committed to Syria's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and prosperity. Israel's ongoing actions and attacks seriously undermine the efforts to bring stability in Syria. These illegal actions and attacks cannot be explained by any legitimate security concern and unacceptable. So this Council should react accordingly. Over the years, we have actively engaged in dialogue with regional and international partners, including through recent meetings in Doha and Aqaba, to ensure that the national reconciliation and the transitional process aligns with the principles of inclusivity and stability. Finally, the international community must not turn a blind eye to the atrocities committed by the Assad regime, exemplified by the horrific images emerging from Sidnaya prison and the Damascus region. Justice and accountability are essential to healing the wounds of the Syrian people and ensuring that such crimes are never repeated. At this critical juncture, let us recommit to standing with the Syrian people in their pursuit of a free, inclusive, and united Syria, one that will serve as a pillar of stability for the entire region. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Turkey for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite council members to informal consultations to continue our discussions on this subject. The meeting is adjourned.